Hi, and welcome to In Search of Insight, Nootropics Depot's monthly podcast. I'm your podcast host, Erika, and sitting next to me is our product specialist at Nootropics Depot, Emiel.
Hey everyone.
Today, Emiel and I are going to be talking all about the immune system. We're going to be telling you the function of the immune system, a little bit of how it works, and how we can adjust our behavior and also our supplement stack to support our immune system to keep us healthy all year round, especially in these cold and dark and wet winter months.
And speaking of dark, cold, and wet, there's quite a bit of rain outside right now and wind, so apologies if you hear that on the recording. You probably will if we just listen closely. So we've been having a lot of winter storms here. We can't really record around it, so unfortunately we have to do with the winter weather.
It does add a little bit of nice background ambiance, though.
Yes.
And another interesting point that we can talk about today is how our environment contributes a lot to the health and the function of our immune system. And something Emiel and I have both noticed since we have moved to the Netherlands, where it's raining really often. It's quite dark in the wintertime, and people are spending more time indoors. We compare that to what our life was like in Phoenix, Arizona, where we were spending more time outside in the winter. The sun is always shining and the environment is generally way drier. And we noticed that here people are getting sick a lot more around us. We too are also getting sick more frequently, and you might be able to hear that in our voices still as well.
Yes. And I think a really interesting thing too is that the Netherlands is a much more dense, smaller country. And as is the case with most of Europe, we tend to be quite social out in the world. When we lived in the US, things are much bigger. The contact between people is much lower. So the incidences of getting sick was also much lower. I remember I would get sick somewhat frequently living in the Netherlands, and then when I moved to Phoenix, I hardly ever got sick. And of course, I think COVID has a lot to do with that too. There were a period of time where Eric and I just didn't leave the house because we didn't want to get infected with COVID.
Or infect anybody else with
Or
COVID.
infect anyone else, of course. And we wore a lot of masks and we did a lot of social isolation. And
we had our groceries delivered. We did a lot of things
exactly
in a way so that we wouldn't be interacting with other people.
And I basically didn't get sick for 3 years.
Yeah.
I think I might have had COVID one time, but when I was taking the tests, they were inconclusive. I wasn't showing any positive symptoms, even though it seemed very likely that it was the case. You did
Yes.
get COVID one time from being around a lot of musicians, I think, as well.
Yeah.
And musicians tend to be a lot more social, tend to spend a lot of time in closed environments, like a practice studio with a bunch of other people, playing instruments where you're blowing air through it and essentially micronizing and blowing virus and bacterial particles all over the place potentially. So you ended up getting it.
Yeah.
I think I got it, but the tests were inconclusive. But I do think that illustrates the point we're going to be making in this podcast, is that prevention is the real key. And we can't live a life completely indoors, separated from everyone else. We have to be social. We have to also think about our mental health, and being social is very important for that. So how do we kind of weigh the risks and benefits of being around people in cold, dark times where our mood might be low and we actually need some more of that socialization time? And how do we prevent then from that socialization time leading to sickness?
Yes. And our immune system is, of course, the defense that our bodies have against any kind of external factor, a virus, a sickness, something that's going to cause us to get sick and be down and not functional for a couple of days. And the immune system has a lot of different elements and a lot of different functions and can be a bit complex to understand. So we're going to break it down for you more simply today and talk about how our immune system works just normally, and then how supplements are also going to change the way that our immune system works so that it can keep us healthier, and also some of the elements that our immune system uses to keep us healthy, like inflammation and oxidation, how we can understand this better and then better respond to certain kinds of illnesses that we might be experiencing, or just having a bit more clarity on what it is that we do when we're getting sick and our fever or our temperature spikes and what's happening in our bodies, and whether it's smart to boost our immune system, to maybe tone down our immune system response, and why that might help in certain cases rather than others.
Yeah, and for the first time ever, we're going to be looking at inflammation and oxidation as friends. Usually we're trying to suppress inflammation and oxidation levels, and that's good for general overall health. But one thing we'll discover throughout this podcast is that the oxidation and inflammation processes within our body actually make up the immune system. So if you look at out of control inflammation, chronic inflammation, that can have very negative impacts on cognitive function, mood, just the general function of our muscles and joints and things like that. That's inflammation outside of the context of immune function. And within the context of immune function, inflammation and oxidation is designed to actually kill things that are coming into our body that we don't want to come into our body, like bacteria, pathogens, things like that. And we will be looking at inflammation and oxidation as a positive process here, which is quite a departure from what we're normally looking at. And the interesting thing is we might actually be telling you to stay away from some inflammation regulating supplements, but we'll get to that later. First of all, we always want to take something on this podcast that then has a bit of a perceivable effect. So you can see what some of these supplements, what effects they have in real time on us. With immune boosting supplements, that's going to be a little bit hard. I don't think it will be very interesting to see us take a big dose of vitamin C or even glutathione, things that we normally take for immune function. So I spent quite a bit of time looking for something that we could take that illustrates how unique and interesting the immune system is while still having a perceivable impact on us. And the supplement we ended up landing on is GABA. And that might sound really surprising, but one other big benefit, I think, of COVID, like we talked about earlier, a big benefit of COVID was, of course, being able, you can always isolate, being forced to isolate, was kind of an interesting experiment, at least for both of us, or for me. I'm not sure how interesting it was for you, but for me it was a very interesting experiment to see what staying away from people, wearing a mask, doing basically everything you're supposed to do and you normally don't do because it's just too much to constantly think about, like washing your hands, not touching your face and your eyes, and we'll also get into why that is important. But I think COVID instilled a lot of good behaviors in us that can help us prevent from getting sick, and we should continue to do those behaviors. But one other really interesting aspect of COVID was that it boosted research quite a lot. There's been a lot of research on COVID-19. There's been a lot of research on COVID-19 and botanicals and different processes that are happening in the body. And before you get too excited, we will not be telling you how to get rid of COVID or to prevent COVID or anything like that. That is not within our wheelhouse. We will not be talking about that. But we will be talking about some of the research that was born out of this era where we all were dealing with a mass global epidemic and a very high need for research. And one of the interesting things of this research was that if you take GABA, then you might actually be boosting your innate immune system, which will also get into the differences between different parts of our immune system, but it helps boost our innate immune system. And it seems that a lot of immune cells actually have GABAergic receptors on them, and stimulating these GABAergic receptors on these immune cells can produce an immune boosting effect. And that can prevent viral replication, but it can also dampen some of the negative effects of an infection. So I think that's really interesting. And a really interesting thing about this, we will be talking a lot about gut health in this episode too, because our gut has a major effect on immune function. And one thing that I find quite interesting is that the bacteria, the good bacteria in our gut, are quite good at generating GABA. From various amino acids that we consume, such as glutamic acid. A lot of these, like lactobacillus bacteria, that are very beneficial, and we get through a lot of fermented foods and things like that, or just probiotic supplements. These lactobacillus bacteria, they contain an enzyme called glutamic acid decarboxylase, GAD. And that enzyme is responsible for turning glutamic acid that you might find in your diet into GABA, which means that there's a lot of GABA actually being produced in our gut because we consume quite a lot of glutamic acid on a daily basis. And that made me think that's what initially led me to GABA, because I thought, okay, our good beneficial probiotics are very important for maintaining proper immune function and ramping up that immune response. So if those beneficial bacteria are producing GABA, then potentially GABA has an effect on our immune system. Turns out this is true. There is a lot of research on it. And the interesting thing is, oral GABA seems to work, but also just general GABAergics. Like if you were to take lemon balm or shodan or Bacopa monnieri, even like magnolia bark that is directly acting on the GABAergic, even coriander, our favorite GABAergic, those could all have beneficial effects on immune function, which I find really fascinating, especially once we get talking about sickness behavior and how being sick can actually mimic a lot of negative mental health outcomes that we might deal with on a daily basis. So, to give the GABA some time to kick in, let's actually have some.
Yes, sounds good. And today we're going to be taking GABA powder that we're going to dissolve in some water. Yep. So what's our dosage today?
So our dose in these glasses, as you can see, it's quite a bit of powder. I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah.
There's 2 grams of powder in here. I actually don't have our capsules here, so I still have some of my beta testing batch of GABA. But we should actually get GABA capsules, because I am quite curious to run an experiment on that. But
for sure.
This would be the equivalent basically of taking 3 of our tablets or capsules, because each capsule contains 700 milligrams of GABA, so that would give you 2100 milligrams. This is 2000 milligrams.
Okay.
So we'll just dissolve this in some water.
And while Emiel is pouring some water into our GABA solution, I think it's fascinating to talk about the immune system now, because the immune system, of course, has been essential for the survival of our species since humans have existed, but it's also
and not just our species.
Well,
all species.
All species,
yeah.
For sure. But it's also something that feels particularly topical, as there are a lot of different kinds of allergies and allergy research these days, talking about gluten, talking about other kinds of food allergies, and there are a lot of people who also experience immune disorders, and we can't touch on those things today. We can't really be specific to talking about how to deal with disorders within the immune system, but it is fascinating to learn about how the immune system works a little bit more in detail, because if you are someone who experiences issues from an immune disorder, or if you're a person who experiences a lot of allergies, we're going to be talking about the histamine response and the inflammation that happens when there are pathogens or external factors that come into the body that the body wants to get rid of. And that can help us understand these other things a little bit better, though we can't be specific in talking about allergies or disorders.
Absolutely. And if this intro has elucidated anything yet, it is that the immune system is really complex, like one of the more complex systems. It's always daunting to me when I'm in a position where I'm creating content on the immune system, because the immune system, I feel like every time I sit down to research the immune system, I learn new profound things, like this GABA mechanism. So
yes.
Let's also, this, cheers, by the way, but I find it really interesting that I just poured water on 2 grams of powder, and it dissolved without any agitation except for the stirring. So I wish all powders dissolved as well.
Yes.
So
okay, cheers for the GABA.
One kind of unpleasant thing about GABA for me, I don't know if you have this, but I get kind of a tingling sensation.
Where?
Just all over my mouth a little bit. And
I experience it a little bit in the back of my throat, but not my entire mouth.
We've taken GABA. GABA can be produced by bacteria in our gut. It can also be produced by lipopolysaccharide, a compound we will keep coming back to. We'll shorten it to LPS. It will be easier to talk about LPS. LPS can also trigger GABAergic processes. So it definitely seems like GABA is an important part of our immune system, which I find really interesting because GABA is one of my favorite neurotransmitters. So of course, I am a little bit biased here. But I do find it interesting because I never really had an idea that GABA had a positive effect on the immune system. And I do find it funny that one time I had a really bad cold and then I drank a very high ABV beer and all my symptoms went away. And then it got way worse. So I think the GABAergic effects of the ethanol had a positive, temporary positive effect, and all of the other effects of alcohol just wrecked me. So in general, also, we want to have behavioral responses or behavioral patterns, such as small amounts of alcohol consumption, not large amounts of alcohol consumption, that will increase our chances of being able to fight off infections.
Yes. But it's funny that you mentioned this because I was asking Emiel earlier, would alcohol have a beneficial effect for your immune system? Because if we're taking GABA, and GABA is something that is working in our bodies, our brains, when we're also drinking alcohol, then there's a connection there. And turns out that is the case, but like Emiel said, drinking large amounts of alcohol is not going to help you get better when you're sick. No. Although it might relieve some of the temporary symptoms that you're feeling, depending on what kind of illness you have.
And we'll talk about symptom relief a lot too, because as weird as this sounds, we're going to be focusing on laying into those symptoms and not getting rid of them, because getting rid of those symptoms early on can actually decrease your chances of a successful fighting off of that infection. That will be quite interesting to chat about. But the next beverage, and that will immediately launch us into the first part of this conversation, probiotics, will be some kombucha. And this is a kombucha that's being locally brewed. If you're in the Netherlands, you've maybe seen them, especially if you're in Amsterdam. Leave your sort kombucha. Definitely go check them out if you're into kombucha. They make unpasteurized kombucha, which is really important because kombucha, coming back to the alcohol conversation, the yeasts and bacteria that make up the SCOBY, the symbiotic community of bacteria and yeasts, and the SCOBY is this floating disc of cellulose that you would see in a kombucha brew. The interesting thing actually is that people have attributed way more properties to the SCOBY than they should have, because it is really just a raft of cellulose. The SCOBY itself actually doesn't have a big impact. The bacteria and yeast, that symbiotic community, is already in the liquid, the fermentation liquid for kombucha. And that fermentation liquid is basically sugar water and tea. In this case, it's a milky oolong tea, which I think is also quite interesting because our gut bacteria, they can interact with polyphenols from tea to create compounds that are immune stimulating too. So drinking kombucha, you're gonna get all of those probiotics. Oh, and the main point I was trying to make, those yeasts can take that sugar and turn it into small amounts of alcohol. And in the US, and this was actually Lindsay Lohan, believe it or not, is responsible for single-handedly fucking up the entire kombucha industry in the US. So she, I guess, was in a rehab program or something like that. She wasn't allowed to consume ethanol. She went in to get tested. They found ethanol in her system, and she claimed it was because of all the kombucha she was drinking. So then people started going to, I think it was even a Whole Foods, and there was a bottle of kombucha that had been a little bit warm. Warmth would speed up the fermentation rate, and it was kind of exploding inside of the bottle already. And when they tested that, the ABV percentage was quite high. I think it was above 3% ABV, which is like the ABV percentage of maybe like a session IPA or a session beer. So it's quite a bit. So ever since then, kombucha is basically being distilled because the US passed a law that you have to, I think, be under 1% ethanol in a brew, which is kind of ridiculous because if you look at a lot of fermented foods, they probably contain higher than 1% ethanol, even if you look at some sauerkraut or something like that, because there are naturally occurring yeast, there are sugars, and when there's yeasts and sugars, there will always be some level of ethanol production, even in like a piece of fruit. If you're eating an apple, especially an apple that's aged for a little bit, the yeasts on the outside of the apple are interacting with the sugars inside of that apple and producing small amounts of ethanol. So there's really no way around ethanol. But the really unfortunate thing about this whole Lindsay Lohan kombucha story is that now, basically, when you brew kombucha, you have a very complex network of lots of different beneficial bacteria.
Hundreds of different types of bacteria.
Maybe
right?
even thousands.
Yeah.
Kombucha isn't as well researched, but there's a style of beer in Belgium called Geuze, or Lambic. I believe Geuze is the sparkling variety of Lambic, which is a still variety of beer. But basically what they do is they brew up the wort, kind of similar to what you do with kombucha too, to create a liquid that is rich in fermentable sugars. And then it is pumped into something you call a cool ship, and that cool ship cools down the grain extract basically, but in doing so drops a lot of yeast and bacteria from the air into the broth, which then cultivates them, and that produces a sour beer. And the interesting thing about this sour beer, the fermentations can go on for many years. It goes into barrels. Those bacteria get oxygen and environments where there's low oxygen, and that produces different bacterial metabolites and different bacteria. And every time they test a bottle of this Geuze or Lambic, they find new species of bacteria they had never known before. So if you think of just a normal kombucha brew that isn't being pasteurized, then all of those bacteria are alive, and you could potentially have thousands, millions, even unidentified beneficial bacteria species in a bottle of kombucha like this, which is why I like brewing my own kombucha or buying from companies like this. And there's a bunch of companies, and this is absolutely not a kombucha ad, by the way, but we do really like drinking kombucha for its probiotic benefits. So this kombucha they're not distilling out the ethanol. And because they're not distilling out the ethanol, all of the bacteria that were initially in there to actually produce this beverage are still in there and not killed. If you look at a lot of the kombucha in the US,
Commercially made in really large quantities.
Correct. If you look at the back, oftentimes you'll see that there's bacteria being added back in. And that's because they're being distilled, the ethanol is being pulled out of the kombucha, and then that kombucha, now all of the beneficial bacteria that are in there are dead because they're sensitive to heat. So now you have to add in back live cultures, but oftentimes that's one or two different probiotic strains.
Not thousands. And I have a question. Is that the same with yogurt then? Because if yogurt is being pasteurized, then you're also going to be eliminating all of the bacteria. But then I always look at the back label of my yogurt. I can see that there are sometimes a couple of different bacteria, live cultures that are added back in after the fact.
Well, in there, you have to go back a little bit too, because you're not pasteurizing the actual yogurt, usually. Because acidity, which we'll also talk about, one of the first lines of defenses against pathogens coming into your body is your stomach acid, because low pH levels are very hostile to various bacteria and even viruses, so you end up killing them. And the same, of course, in yogurt. You drop the pH lower and lower and lower. It's a good preservation method for milk, dairy. You turn it into yogurt. Now the beneficial bacteria in that yogurt are fighting off bad bacteria, molds or bacteria that could make you sick and give you food poisoning. So fermentation, by far, is mostly a food preservation technique. So if I were to take, because this kombucha was brewed on the 18th of October, so many months ago, if I were to just have sugar water sitting around without the necessary bacteria in there, it would start to grow molds, and there's no way I'm getting anywhere near to that. This, however, I could keep for another couple of years. The flavors would keep getting more complex and interesting. I've tested this out myself with some homemade kombucha too, but most of all, the lower pH level, the high amount of bacteria in here are fighting off other things that might want to come in and proliferate. But because there's so much competition of better, good bacteria in here, those bad bacteria, they can't take over, or those molds can't take over because there is a low pH. So that bacterial diversity and that bacterial diversity fighting off bad bacteria is part of the reason why we also want to boost our good probiotic levels in our gut. That's one of the reasons. The other reasons we'll get into after we have a glass of kombucha. Hopefully it doesn't gush. That's another thing with some of this unpasteurized stuff. There might be bacteria in here that lay dormant for a while, and they can actually munch on sugars that the other bacteria and yeast can't. So when you close a bottle like this, and these bottles I think are bottle conditioned, which means that a little bit more remaining sugar is in here, the bottle gets capped off, and then the bacteria and some of the yeasts are producing carbon dioxide as they're munching through those sugars, and that's carbonating it in this bottle. That can mean that sometimes it gushes. And we're good.
Nice. I think it's interesting to touch on something you said about the fact that fermentation is a food preservation method. Mm-hmm. And one element that we've talked about in recent podcasts, especially our podcast that we did with Lucas, talking about the past and the future of supplements, was how everything in our environment is connected. Not only human species, animal species, their immune systems are also fighting off pathogens and external factors that are going to make them sick. And when a plant has a protection method for itself, we might also reap the benefits from that. When we were talking about the way that plants fight off disease or fight off pests, some of these plants that have really good mechanisms for fighting off, external factors, those ones will also give us a better ability to fight off external factors, pathogens, and keep us healthier as well. So if our food is fermented and our food is better preserved, which helps the food stay healthy and stay functional and stay safe for us to eat, then it makes sense that eating that would also help us preserve the healthy bacteria in our own microbiomes in our gut.
Yes. And that's one of the reasons I think humans have always consumed fermented foods, one of which is to just take advantage of the food preservation mechanism behind it. And another is probably because we recognized early on that it can have a beneficial effect on our overall health and our immune function, and also tempering our immune system during times when we're not sick.
Yes. So let's have some kombucha.
And yeah, very low sugar content because the bacteria have munched through basically all of the sugars, but there's some really nice flavors in here.
Yeah.
A lot of people hate kombucha. I totally understand it. You probably haven't had good kombucha though, because I think this is pretty hard to hate on.
This tastes more like a slightly milder lemonade, or like an Arnold Palmer, but with a little bit less acidity, for sure.
Yeah. And that's because an interesting thing happens, because kombucha can create actually ethanol, and ethanol can get turned into vinegar, acetic acid, by Acetobacter bacteria. So if you expose kombucha to too much oxygen during the production method, that small amount of ethanol can be turned into acetic acid, vinegar, which gives kombucha a distinct vinegariness.
And I've noticed that with some kombuchas that I've bought from the grocery store, some brands in particular can taste very vinegary, almost like I'm drinking apple cider vinegar, and I don't like that. But it's interesting that flavor is also a bit of a defect when it comes to finding a kombucha that's effective for giving you those healthy bacteria. So something to keep in mind when you are looking for or trying out some different kombuchas.
And now that I'm thinking about it, that might actually be a deliberate technique in order to drop the ethanol concentration to get it within the spec of under 1% ethanol, because if you're turning some of that ethanol into acetic acid, then yes, you are introducing a vinegar flavor into your kombucha, but on the other hand, you're lowering the ethanol concentrations. And that might be what I think GT Dave Kombucha, also a popular brand. They're not pasteurized. Theirs definitely taste more vinegary than something like this. This does definitely have some ethanol in it, because you don't taste that acetic acid. But again, that could also have beneficial effects, but we won't get into that. Small amounts of ethanol can be good, but that's a topic for a different podcast.
Yes.
So let's actually start talking about how the immune system works.
Yes.
After we have a bit more fermented food.
Sounds good.
If you want to pass the sauerkraut.
Yes. We prepared a snack for this podcast because one thing that you might have learned over the past couple of years as fermented foods like sauerkraut and kimchi have become super popular is that what we eat and what we drink has a huge effect on our immune system, and sauerkraut is something that has been around for a very, very long time. And I think before maybe the last 10 years or 15 years was more of a hippie food or more of a traditional food and not something that was really trendy. But nowadays fermented food is super trendy, and it's also super healthy for us. And it's awesome because we have a container of this really nice, super fresh and kind of mild sauerkraut, and I think it's coming from France, right?
Yeah, it's coming from the Alsace in France, and this is produced through real fermentation. So when you're looking at pickles and things like that, there's two categories. There's fermented pickles and then there's vinegar pickles. And a lot of commercial pickles or even sauerkraut, you basically just shred up some cabbage, you dunk it in a solution of vinegar and salt, which does a fantastic job at preserving the food too.
Like we were just talking about with kombucha.
Correct, because that vinegar is dropping the pH enough where it's becoming quite a inhospitable environment to a lot of bad bacteria, but the good bacteria can still survive, like the lactobacillus bacteria. And then the salt concentration. Salt is also an antimicrobial, so salt can suppress the growth of bad bacteria while still allowing the lactobacillus enzyme or bacteria to grow. And in real fermented sauerkraut, you're just taking the cabbage, which is covered in lactobacillus enzymes already. If you take any fruit or vegetable, especially organic fruits and vegetables, and I think there's a lot of debate about organic fruits and non-organic fruits and fruits and vegetables that are coming from like thousands of kilometers away by the airplane. A lot of those foods have to be preserved somehow. So sometimes if you have like a tomato from the grocery store that you buy in the winter when you don't have any local tomatoes, or they're coming out of a greenhouse, but if you just buy a tomato, like maybe it's coming from a warmer climate and it has to travel quite a while, a lot of that food is irradiated. So it means that you just put radiation on it. Gamma irradiation is the most popular method. But what that does is it kills all of the bacteria and yeast that are on the outside of these fruits and vegetables. And that's also part of the reason why they stay better for much longer. If you go to your organic, we like going to farmers markets a lot. And if you buy those vegetables, and in my own fermentation trials, I've also noticed this, if I buy something from the supermarket, the fermentation is oftentimes really slow to start. Whereas stuff that I buy from a farmer's market, sometimes it takes off so quickly in terms of fermentation that I'm pretty sure if I just eat those vegetables without fermenting them, I'm getting enough probiotics. And I think that's an interesting thing to consider when you're looking at high quality, organic, hippie food in that sense versus more commercial supermarket food, is probably that even if you're buying some of those hippie local farmers market vegetables, is that they're covered in probiotics already. And the interesting thing with fermentation is that you can multiply those probiotics. So all you're doing is you're taking the cabbage that's covered in lactobacillus bacteria and various yeasts, and then you're giving it an environment where those lactobacillus enzymes can grow with a lot of vigor and other things can't. So the way you do this is you deprive it from oxygen, because lactobacillus enzymes or bacteria are anaerobic, so they don't need oxygen. and you add salt, because lactobacillus can handle a salt concentration of about 3%, and other bad things can't. So by doing that, you're maximizing the amount of lactobacillus that's being created. And a lot of the probiotics we end up taking are lactobacillus bacteria. So they're all around us. They're on every single surface. They're on our fruits and vegetables, especially ones that are coming from a farmer's market, especially ones that are maybe a little bit more dirty in a sense. And fermenting them kind of enhances that property. And all of those bacteria coming into our gut has beneficial effects on our overall immune system. So let's have some sauerkraut.
Sounds good. Fork for you.
And the interesting thing about sauerkraut is that if you compare this to clear kombucha, there is probably some starches and fibers in here that have not become chewed through in the fermentation process. But this, of course, is much more fiber rich, which is interesting because one of the main reasons we actually eat fermented foods, or we have the probiotics, is so that our gut microbiome can take some of those starches and fibers and turn them into short chain fatty acids like butyrate, which then have an effect on the mucosal linings and just our general overall immune function. So we want both fibers, which we generally like to call prebiotics, and we want to take a source of those biotics, or bacteria. So in this case, sauerkraut, but also just high quality fruits and vegetables, kombucha, yogurt, maybe even some raw milk, but safety is kind of out on that. We eat a lot of raw milk cheese without any issues.
Yes.
In the US, that's just kind of not allowed.
Yeah. We still haven't tried raw milk just as a beverage and to cook with or whatnot, but we do have a source close by, so I'm curious to try it.
Well, and that's actually what I was coming back to with the yogurt question. A lot of the times, yes, you pasteurize your milk, you kill everything that's in the milk, then you add your culture to the milk, and then you cultivate that culture inside of the milk, and then, hey, voila, you have yogurt. But if you're using raw milk, which I'm pretty sure when we go to Lindehof and we buy their yogurt, they're probably using raw milk and just using the basically endogenous lactobacillus enzymes, or bacteria. I don't know why I keep saying enzymes, but the bacteria that are in there, they are producing the fermentation step. So maybe there's more diversity then. But a lot of these types of foods are beneficial. They're tasty. They're good for you. And yeah, you're just topping up your probiotics in your system. So let's try this. And I think it's delicious.
We are just eating straight sauerkraut right now. Just plain, delicious, fresh, and not overly salty sauerkraut.
And salt plays an important role in our immune function too. So when we are getting sick, eating some salty foods like this can be beneficial, especially because we're upping our probiotic intake. But I won't put you through watching me eat this whole bowl. So we can get to the nitty-gritty now, after I finish this bite.
And maybe right before we get to the nitty-gritty, we can also just check in on how you're feeling after taking that nice GABA dose earlier.
It's starting to kick in a little bit. And I think this will be another... We're talking about the immune system, but I do think it is important to touch on GABA. That a lot of people think that GABA just doesn't work. And I will say that I was one of those people who just thought oral GABA wouldn't be able to do anything because it doesn't...
You mean in terms of perceptible benefits?
Correct.
Okay.
Because it doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. That's not true. It does cross the blood-brain barrier, but in very, very small amounts. So it's not efficient. So if you're taking a gram or 2 grams of GABA, you're not getting 2 grams of GABA in your brain. But that's maybe a good thing because it's been, half an hour-ish now,
Yes.
I can start to feel clear GABAergic effects.
Me too.
And there's two reasons for this. One is that a small amount does still make it across the blood-brain barrier. It will happen. Maybe that's a very small percentage. So we're taking 2 grams, maybe we're only getting 20 milligrams of GABA actually across the blood-brain barrier. But if you think about 20 milligrams of a neurotransmitter, that could actually be quite a lot. So getting 20 milligrams of GABA across the blood-brain barrier, and don't quote me on this, this is just a made-up number, but let's say that is the case, then taking GABA is a very, very, very inefficient way of getting GABA into the brain, but it still works.
Okay.
And it's cheap, and it's safe to take higher doses of it, so it makes sense to be able to take a higher dose. Like our 700 milligram capsules, I usually like taking 1.4 grams, and it definitely has a nice GABAergic effect. So one of them is that small amounts can probably make it through the blood-brain barrier. The other is that there's a gut-brain axis mechanism at play. So GABA can bind to peripheral receptors. Hey, it doesn't have to cross the blood-brain barrier at all. It can bind to GABA receptors in the gut. And by doing that, it can actually interface with the brain and cause changes in the brain, even though the GABA isn't actually making it into the brain. So there could be some effects there too. Another thing that I've toyed around with a little bit is that it might be that GABA is turning into something else that can cross the blood-brain barrier. Again, maybe in very small amounts, but GABA could potentially be turning into very small amounts of gamma-hydroxybutyric acid, which if you know, you know. We won't get into that. But that might have an effect because GABA could, through some bacterial mechanisms as well, turn into very, very small amounts, which could have a perceptible effect. But either way, I'm noticing right now a muscle relaxation effect. And again, that could be because of a peripheral mechanism where not a lot of it is making it through the blood-brain barrier, but if it's acting on actual muscle cells, it could be relaxing those. And there is some very interesting research about GABA, and if you take it orally, that it can attach to GABA receptors in our GI tract and cause relaxation in our GI tract that way, which could make it very beneficial for people who have things like irritable bowel syndrome. But back to the immune function, and let's get out of our stomach.
Yes.
And into this sphere. So
the rest of our body.
Yes. So if you look at a person, you can see their immune system, because the biggest part of your immune system is your skin.
Yes.
Your skin is a very nice barrier, because if you think about it, you're out in the world, you're constantly coming into contact with lots of bacteria, lots of viruses, lots of pathogens, all sorts of bad shit that you don't want inside of your body. Now, if you were just an open sieve, anything would be coming in and you would be getting sick all the time. I mean, you wouldn't be getting sick all the time, you would just die.
If you were covered with lots of scratches or wounds, this is another example we can use. That's the main and most efficient way for a pathogen to get from outside into your body.
Well, not really, because you don't even need any open cuts. Because if I shake your hand, like I'm completely clean now, and let's pretend you have a pathogen on you. So we shake hands. If I never put this hand anywhere near an open area, a cut, or anything else, then I'll be safe. I can walk around with this for hours, go wash my hand, I'm safe. That's usually not what happens.
Yeah.
And apparently a lot of us end up touching our face very soon after we end up shaking hands with someone, so this would be the more normal situation. Hello, nice to meet you. Infected.
Yes, and the reason why you're going to get infected from touching your eyes or your nose or your mouth is because we don't have the same kind of barrier, we don't have the same kind of system to prevent these bacteria or pathogens from entering. Although our saliva and the fluid that's in these parts of our bodies does do somewhat of a job in stopping some pathogens. A
very good job. I'm making it very simple now, where, of course, if I end up transferring a pathogen from your hand to my hand, and then I end up introducing it potentially into my circulation through my eye, my nose, or my mouth, maybe even my ears, and of course the other orifices down there can definitely transmit infections too. But there are also defenses elsewhere. But the main defense is our skin. It's very impenetrable. Of course, if you have cuts, that's an easy way to get an infection through, but those infections can still be contained. Like if you get lots of pus and things like that, it does mean that there's a small compartment that's full of immune cells just fighting everything they can at the infection, the pathogen, the intruder, and it's keeping it nice and contained and still won't spread throughout your whole body. But when you touch your eyes or your nose or your mouth, then there's much more chance that now something went from outside your body to inside your body. And within your eyes, you also have a microbiome. So we usually talk about our gut as our gut microbiome, but you have microbiomes everywhere. So your eyes have certain bacteria, beneficial bacteria that can fight off pathogens. But there's also different types of antibodies, immunoglobulins, all that sort of stuff in your eyes that can also fight off potential intruders. The same thing in your mouth, and the same thing in your nose, specifically in your nose. Because if you think about your nose is a very nice filter. A much better filter than your mouth. So there's a lot of talk, especially nowadays, about mouth breathing and not mouth breathing. In general, if you can breathe through your nose, you should breathe through your nose, because your nose is a better filter to the outside world than your mouth is. Of course, you can't always breathe through your nose, but if you can breathe through your nose, that's good, because it means that if you are breathing in a bacteria, it's first coming into contact with these mucous membranes, and those mucous membranes actually kind of act as like a fly trap. So they can trap bacteria on there, and then within that mucus there are compounds and enzymes and all sorts of bad stuff for the bacteria, for the virus, for the pathogen that can kill it before it enters circulation. So that's really, once we've crossed the initial skin barrier, now we're just trying to slow it from infecting our whole body, because usually we're dealing with a very small amount that then replicates within our body and then causes issues. So
we're still talking about the innate immune system, by the way. So our mouth,
our adaptive immune system does play a role here too.
So we should clarify then that we have two categories for our immune system. We have our innate immune system, and then we have the adaptive immune system. And most of what we will talk about today, and most of what you read about in terms of boosting your immune system, is specifically focused on the innate immune system. And this is the immune system that's happening, or that's basically keeping us safe and healthy all the time. And our skin is a part of that system. The properties that are in our saliva, that's in our mouth, that's in those mucous membranes in our nose, our eyes, even our stomach, that are fighting against bad bacteria and pathogens, that's also a part of the innate immune system. And the innate immune system is quite complex, but it's also a lot more general than if we compare it to the adaptive immune system. The adaptive immune system is really specifically focused on attacking an individual or the intruder. And there are different cells and different systems that are happening when our adaptive immune system kicks in, which is going to be focused specifically on that intruder when we're getting sick with a cold or the flu or something like that. And the effects of that immune system are going to feel different and have a different outcome than the innate immune system.
So you almost nailed it. The real difference is that the innate immune system is kicking in quickly. When you're coming into contact with something bad, your innate immune system is kicking in. Your adaptive immune system is what you call a memory immune system. It has a memory. So let's say I get infected with a cold. My innate immune system is kicking in. Well, my innate immune system is first doing the job of preventing that cold virus, the coronavirus, from making it into my body. If it fails and it does make it into my body, then my innate immune system ramps up a response and gets rid of that intruder. Hopefully. If that doesn't happen and the fight keeps going on and on and on, then over many days, like 7 days, 14 days, it can take quite a while, the adaptive immune system with lots of different cells, they start learning. And they start making basically like an imprint of the virus, the bacteria, the pathogen, whatever they're fighting. So let's say we are talking about a cold. I get a cold, it infects me, I get very sick from that cold and it's not going away. Then now, as this immune response is going, my adaptive immune response is learning. And when I get better, that memory stays. So then when I'm out in the world again and I come into contact with that exact same coronavirus, the cold virus, my body will immediately know what to do specifically. So the innate immune system does a really good job, but it basically sees everything as a threat. And it ends up damaging our normal cells too. So it's very unspecific, but it does a great job of killing bad things. And it does a pretty good job of killing good things too. So there is a balance there. The adaptive immune system is much more like a trained assassin. So you have your innate immune system. It's just a giant army that's being sent to a threat, but they don't actually know what the threat is. Just anything that looks remotely threatening, they kill. And you have a lot of casualties around that then that are not good. With the adaptive immune system being like a trained assassin, they can go and track exactly the one thing that's bad that came in. And they can engulf it and kill it before it becomes an issue. So that's the real difference, the innate and adaptive immune system. Erika did a good job of introducing the topic, but the real differentiating factor is that one is very fast and one is slow. But even though one is slow, it is very important for keeping us safe after we have come into contact with something, so that we don't keep getting sick with the exact same thing over and over and over again, which would be really bad if that happened, because that means you spend maybe a week or two fighting off a cold, and then you get better, and then you come into contact with that same cold virus again, and you get just as sick. That would be really bad, because you will be coming into contact with that same cold virus over and over and over. So it is very unique that our body can remember this threat and create a system specifically dedicated to getting rid of that threat, and that memory stays for a long time. That memory, the adaptive immune system, can also cause chronic inflammation issues and things like that. So there is a downside to it as well. And that's, of course, kind of how vaccines work as well, when you're training your adaptive immune system. So you're going, hey, body, this is the bad guy. Mm-hmm. We should develop antibodies to destroy that bad guy if that bad guy ends up being in our body. So that's why with a vaccine, you can take a vaccine which kind of mimics you getting sick with the virus or the bacteria or the pathogen or whatever we're talking about. It can mimic that. It can teach your body this is exactly what you need to do when you come into contact with this intruder. And it's very quick. But usually when we're talking about boosting our immune function, and especially the protocols that we engage in when we actually get sick and we're trying to get better, we're very much focused on the innate immune system, because we're talking about a small period of time. And usually the first day or so is quite critical. That's where we want to really get into and just kind of let things take its course. But let's take another step back. So now we know a very good difference between the innate and adaptive immune system. And we will talk a little bit about the adaptive immune system, but the majority of this will be about our innate immune system. So, main skin barrier, something gets in, and the mucous membranes, the microbiome, all of the defense systems, the air filter in our nose, it's not having an effect. Now we've got something traveling down our throat. Mm-hmm. And our throat is lined with mucous membranes too that can catch all of those bacteria. So all the way down to our stomach, we have defenses in place to continuously kill those bacteria and those pathogens. And then once they get into our stomach, like we were talking about with the fermented foods, now we see a rapid decrease in pH levels, and that ends up killing most of the bacteria and viruses that end up coming within our stomach. If they don't, they end up being taken into circulation.
Okay.
And that's when shit hits the fan. So we can be totally good, like on a daily basis, we're coming into contact with lots and lots of bacteria and viruses, and we don't get sick very often. Maybe like I've gotten sick in 2023. I think I got sick twice.
Mm-hmm.
Not too severely. And you too, I think.
Yeah, I got sick more than you. But
Yeah.
this is also maybe an interesting thing to share, which is that we notice a big difference between our individual immune responses, especially when there is a cold or a flu or some other kind of illness going around. I can get really sick really quickly and be totally not functional, need to stay in bed for a day or two. And I've had this experience a couple times since we've lived here in the Netherlands. But I find that after 1 or 2 days of just resting, not doing anything else, but feeling really, really sick, then I'm almost completely recovered and my bounce back time is quite short. Meal, on the other hand, is a little bit of the opposite, where it will take quite some time or quite some exposure, I think, for you to actually get sick, for you to actually be infected with something.
Mm-hmm.
But then once you do get sick, you don't have such an extreme or dramatic immune response, especially not compared to my immune response.
Mm-hmm.
But that sickness and those symptoms can last for a little bit longer at a more mild level, and it can sometimes take you some more time to fully get rid of a cold or the sniffles, compared to my experience where I can be down for a day or two and then be right back up and feeling almost completely better.
Yeah. And I actually might have discovered why that is the case. So I have my self-decode page set up, and I have my ancestry.com genetic data loaded into it. And for any of you that are interested in self-decode, we had Joe Cohen on from self-decode. I think it's an interesting system for sure.
Yes, and he was on our previous podcast that was happening earlier this fall.
Correct.
If you want to go check it out, we can link it in the YouTube description below.
And Joe Cohen has created the system where you can upload blood tests, you can upload genetic tests, and then he has basically an algorithm that's combing through a lot of research, and he's also collaborating with doctors and PhD researchers, and they've kind of come together to build this system that then gives you recommendations based on your genetics, and constantly being updated.
And the recommendations are for supplements, but they're also behavioral recommendations as well.
Correct. So I was looking through there to see for myself, because I have my genetic data. You unfortunately don't have your genetic data, so we can't do a direct comparison, but I have my genetic data, and I was looking through some of the recommendations for immune. And one thing that was interesting to me is that because of my genetics, I probably have higher levels of interleukin 10. This is a cytokine, but it's an anti-inflammatory cytokine. So a lot of cytokines are pro-inflammatory. They induce inflammation, which is very important for our immune response. Interleukin 10, on the other hand, is anti-inflammatory. So good for controlling overall inflammation levels. But when you get sick, you mount a huge inflammation response. But because I have higher interleukin 10 levels, I can offset that inflammation response a little bit, which reduces my body temperature. It reduces the massive onslaught of my immune system on the pathogens. So we have to lean into that a bit, because we want what Erika has. We don't want to be sick for 2 weeks mildly. We kind of want to be sick within reason. We don't, of course, if you're very sick and you have really high levels of inflammation
And a really high fever.
and a very high fever,
That's not
that's
safe.
super bad too.
Yeah.
Really, really bad. But if things are kind of normal, you want to actually, and you can't prevent things from progressing and you getting really sick, you actually want to lay into it as much as possible.
And let your immune system do what it needs to do in order to kill and get rid of the infectious bacteria or the pathogen. And that can mean that your fever maybe is a little bit higher, or that you are not going to take as many painkillers or some other
any. So that's kind of the point I want to make.
Yeah.
There's a few different protocols floating around. There's a nice podcast actually between Joe Cohen and Chris Masterjohn about immune system function. We can maybe link that as well.
Yes.
I would definitely check that out. They both have some great ideas on immune function. And so in this podcast, Chris Masterjohn kind of goes through his initial protocol if he feels himself getting sick. So he describes it as a suspicious sneeze or a suspicious sore throat or something like that, to then get right after it, because you're in that prime window of you're not infected yet, but there's probably an infection incoming. So what can you do now to prevent that infection from progressing? So according to Chris Masterjohn, he likes taking zinc, but he likes taking zinc in a lozenge form, because then those ions can distribute through your mouth and your nasal passages, and you can have these zinc ions there, and that can have a beneficial effect on viral replication and can prevent some of the issues from progressing. He then also suggests a nasal spray of betadine. It's like an iodine type of nasal spray that would then, of course, have an antimicrobial effect. And then Joe Cohen also mentions could you spray it in your throat, and that could work too. So that's an interesting protocol. Go check that out. Like, if you're getting sick, I'm definitely going to try this next time. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was interesting that Chris Masterjohn mentioned that if you get sick and you start taking zinc, it's probably already too late. The only thing that would then actually help is the zinc acetate lozenges that then go through your whole mouth and have more of a localized effect. On the other hand, having good zinc status throughout all of your cells is going to have a good immune boosting effect. So take your zinc daily, every day, not just when you're getting sick, is basically the main take-home point there. But if you do, then maybe something like zinc acetate could work. And we've actually never played around with this at Nootropics Depot, and I'm actually kind of curious to look at some zinc in lozenge form now, because that could be a really interesting thing. A lot of our supplements are really designed to help boost your immune system over the long term to prevent. And that's just the whole mindset you need to be in. You always want to prevent getting sick. So take preventative measures, not wait until something goes bad and then start to try and compensate. So anyways.
On that topic, let's say you do get sick and you're starting to feel really hot. You have a fever and maybe you have the chills and your body is achy, or perhaps you feel a little bit nauseous. A normal response would be to take some kind of painkiller that's going to reduce these symptoms and make you feel better, right? Make you feel better in the short term. But what we're going to talk about is why we need to let our immune system do this work of causing inflammation in the body, and that inflammation is actually the plan of attack that our body has against the pathogen to kill it, to get rid of it, and then to help us recover from that.
Yeah, so you have this thing called the oxidative burst. A lot of this is based on oxidation, and oxidation and inflammation play hand in hand. Oftentimes they're seen as two separate entities, but actually they're more similar than they are dissimilar. So when we detect a threat, a pathogen, a bacteria, a virus that's coming into our body, then these immune cells, the killer cells and T cells and white blood cells, they start creating lots of oxidative and inflammatory compounds, inflammatory cytokines, superoxide, peroxynitrite, which is made from an interaction between superoxide and nitric oxide. Those two are coming together, and you have peroxynitrite. You have hypochlorous acid that's being created, which is quite literally bleach. And that, of course, has an antimicrobial effect. And you have hydrogen peroxide that's being generated, which is, you just call that hydrogen peroxide in the US.
Yep.
Interesting that you don't see hydrogen peroxide being used very often in the Netherlands. But in the US, it's very common to treat your cuts with hydrogen peroxide.
It was always a favorite activity when I was growing up, if I had a cut, to take hydrogen peroxide with a Q-tip and to watch it bubble. If I had a cut that was on my hand or something, then you would take a little bit of it and then actually see the chemical process happening.
And hydrogen peroxide is a really strong oxidant. So it helps kill bacteria by oxidizing those bacteria. And so we are producing hydrogen peroxide. We are producing hypochlorous acid. We are
in our
producing
stomach or other parts of our body?
Everywhere.
Okay.
Superoxide. And oftentimes during normal circumstances, we're trying to get rid of those to lower oxidation, to lower inflammation. But here we are actually relying on an increase in oxidation and an increase in inflammation to actually kill the intruders. So if we start immediately taking antioxidants, we could get in the way of this oxidative burst, except for a few, like vitamin C. And I think Chris Masterjohn also at the end of this podcast with Joe Cohen, he has a graphic. It's a very nice graphic where he shows how this whole system works. So I would, again, go check that out. It's a nice accompaniment, I think, to this podcast. But one of the things, of course, we always hear, take vitamin C when you get sick. And there is, even though it is an antioxidant, large doses of vitamin C can actually become pro-oxidative too, which could have a beneficial effect. But one of the reasons is because vitamin C is protective of BH4, an enzyme system that's partially responsible, a cofactor system that's partially responsible for producing nitric oxide, which is important in this oxidative burst system. So we actually want to take vitamin C to a certain degree to further boost the oxidation process that we can inflict on intruders. So in that sense, maybe vitamin C does indeed have a beneficial effect. The research is still kind of out. I do think that if I take larger doses of vitamin C myself, I do notice myself getting better a little bit quicker. But one thing that I tend to do, I think a lot of people tend to do, I start feeling achy, not so nice, like I'm clearly sick. My cognition is starting to slow down. I just feel bad. I want some relief. I take some ibuprofen. Boom. Now all of your inflammation processes are down. And this is actually making you more susceptible because you're basically taking away the main defense mechanism.
And more susceptible to getting more sick? Okay.
Just sick in general because my body increasing inflammation, ramping up my body temperature, it's making it an inhospitable environment to the bacteria and viruses and pathogens that have made their way into my body. And we're trying to kill them off. So, so if you look for example, at a bacterial infection, you're dealing usually with a lot of, and I'm probably going to mess this up. No, I'm not going to. You're usually dealing with gram-negative bacteria, and those bacteria are good at producing lipopolysaccharide, which we mentioned earlier, LPS. And LPS is a polysaccharide type of compound, which has a lipid compound to it too, and it's on the outside of most of these bacteria. And this LPS can produce rapid inflammation, and especially when this happens in the gut. So let's say you were eating bad bacteria from a burrito that's gone bad, and it's full of Escherichia E. coli. Not all E. coli is bad. We have E. coli in our stomach, and E. coli can actually prevent some pathogenic species from taking hold too, so there are some good E. coli strains. But in general, all E. coli strains produce quite a bit of LPS, and especially the bad ones produce quite a bit of LPS. And if you consume enough of these, and they start to proliferate in your gut, you have a lot of this LPS in your gut, that's triggering massive amounts of inflammation. That's then having an effect on the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is sending signals to our hypothalamus. Our hypothalamus responds by turning up the temperature. Because we know, just it's interesting how many parallels there are between like food preparation and our immune system, because one way to prevent ourselves from getting sick from the food we eat if we have to store it for long periods of time is fermentation, because we're lowering the pH levels, we are inoculating it with lots of good bacteria that's keeping bad stuff away. We have some salt in there, which is antimicrobial, a great way of conserving food. Now, the other way of making sure we don't get sick from foods that might already have some bad stuff in there is to heat it up. So we do that with meats. For example, a lot of chicken has salmonella in there. So if you eat raw chicken, you're going to be consuming salmonella, and that salmonella is now going to get you very, very sick. If you cook the chicken properly to a certain temperature, you're going to pasteurize the chicken, and by pasteurizing the chicken, you're going to kill that salmonella and maybe some of the E. coli that you otherwise would be taking into your system. And the way you're getting rid of it is with heat. So, within our own body, to a certain point, increasing the heat is a good way of getting rid of pathogens.
So, when someone, let's say your mom or your partner, is concerned about you because you have a fever, of course it's very kind, but actually the fever itself isn't something to be concerned about as long as it's within a reasonable level. Yes. Of course, we're not giving advice on like what is a serious and not serious fever, but the fever itself is the defense mechanism. The fever itself is cooking, hopefully, the bad bacteria or the pathogen to the point where it just completely dies.
Correct. So, just like with food production, heat is our friend. Low pH levels are our friends. Lots of beneficial bacteria are our friends. But in this scenario, inflammation, which is producing an increase in body temperature, is very important for those initial stages. So, as nice as it may seem to take some ibuprofen, or to even take a supplement like Longvita or Boswellia,
an anti-inflammatory
to dampen that inflammation level and give you higher levels of comfort, might actually be bad. And I have a really interesting anecdote about this. Erika got sick. I was taking care of Erika, and you were really sick. You were sick for quite a while, and I was just not affected by it at all. There's two things that were going on there. It was a very busy time of the year, and we were supposed to be doing a lot of stuff together, but then Erika got sick, so she couldn't do it. So my workload for preparing for the holidays and getting people gifts and stuff like that increased dramatically. So I was a bit stressed, which is good, because it turns out that if you are a little bit stressed and you have higher norepinephrine levels, that's actually good for your immune function.
Wow.
And there's a lot of really interesting stuff that comes with that. And for that, this seems to kind of be the episode where I am advising you go listen to other episodes. And it's because immune function is such a complex thing, and I think there's a lot to say about it. And there's a lot of different angles. And I think Andrew Huberman's angle on immune function and the nervous system, because Andrew Huberman is a neuroscientist primarily. I think he has a very interesting take on how your nervous system influences your immune function. And one of the things he mentions in that podcast is indeed that norepinephrine levels going up can be beneficial for immune function. And I think I noticed that because you were very sick.
Yes.
I was stressed and I wasn't getting sick, and I was taking care of you and everything was fine. And one thing that I was noticing was that I had like kind of an icky inflammation the whole time. So, and we normally take andrographis, so that was that's a good way of controlling inflammation, and it usually does the trick. But even now, I was having issues, so there was some inflammation going on. I think I was actively fighting off whatever you had, because of course I was getting large amounts of it through being in close contact with you. So there was some low-level inflammation going on.
Yes.
I decided it would be a great idea to take high doses of Boswellia and Longvita for a couple of days, and I felt a reduction in symptoms, and after 2 days I got really sick. Yes,
and another part of this which is fascinating is that when you were stressed and you were taking care of me and I was sick and you were running around, you were sort of up here. And then as I was getting better and you didn't have to take care of me and the holiday had passed, you started to relax a little bit more and, take your time and kind of recover from that. And that's when you got sick.
Yes.
It
So
was
I
not
was
in that period of stress. It was in the period of more relaxation.
correct. So I got calm. Norepinephrine levels are dropping, and I started taking lots of anti-inflammatories, thereby basically taking away my body's ability to fight maybe the pathogen. And I got exactly the same thing Erika seemed to have.
Yeah.
Like it was very identical in terms of symptoms, but you had already been sick for like 2 weeks at this point, I think, or well, you had gotten better, and you were totally fine at this point. And 2 weeks later, even though I had been in direct contact with you for 2 weeks, and of course there is some incubation time too, but we're always together, and you were probably incubating a week before you actually got sick. So if you add it all up, it was probably partially my increased stress levels of just being like, holy shit, I gotta do all of this alone now because you're really sick. That stress level kept me safe. Once that was down and I started taking anti-inflammatories, it got worse. And I really needed to focus on work while I was sick, so I was taking some anti-inflammatories here and there so I could actually focus on my work. And that was definitely impacting my recovery time, because I've never been as, like, it was very low level. I was pretty sick for a couple of days, and then it was just very low level for a long time, but I was taking a lot of anti-inflammatories. So, lesson learned. And I know this too, which is kind of stupid that I ended up going for the more comfort route. I should have just stuck it out and gotten as sick as humanly possible, basically, as strange as that sounds. And now I know for next time, I will do the Chris Masterjohn protocol where zinc acetate, and I'll try and find this betadine nasal spray. I think that's really interesting to actually try and stop it in its tracks a little bit more. And then beyond that, just staying away from antioxidants and anti-inflammatories and just laying into it. And of course, you have to be really careful with this, and I'm not recommending this to anyone necessarily, but maybe lay into that heat aspect too. If you can keep your body temperature elevated for a while, that's probably good. So maybe if you're feeling feverish and your temperature is elevated, take a hot shower. Lay into that a little bit more. Dress very warmly. That might also be one of the reasons why we get sick when it's cold outside, because we're literally getting cold, and our core temperature, even if it's only a slight amount, is dropping enough where our defenses, one of those heat defenses against pathogens, is now depressed.
So perhaps there is a logical reason why wearing a hat and keeping yourself really warm when it's raining and cold outside is important for preventing you from getting sick. It might not be that the temperature has anything to do with the pathogens or bacteria that you're experiencing out in the world. So wearing a hat's not going to stop you from being exposed to something that's going to get you sick. But if your body temperature gets quite low, you might be more susceptible to getting sick or having that pathogen take hold more, because your immune system isn't functioning at that temperature, which is going to prevent you from actually getting sick and from that pathogen going into the bloodstream or into other parts of your body.
Yeah, so that could definitely be a part of it, where you have that lower core temperature that's making you more susceptible. So I felt, actually, and both of us felt this, in the last week, I felt that same exact icky inflammation feeling coming back up again. And you did too. Yeah. And you got a little bit congested. You can maybe hear it in this podcast too. And so on Sunday, when I really was feeling it at its height, like, I didn't feel sick, but I felt off. I felt inflamed. I felt off. I recognized the feeling. I took the hottest shower I could possibly endure for a long time, like 20 minutes or so. I closed the door of the bathroom. I really let it fog up in there, and I had basically a bit of a sauna experience. And then after I got out, I dressed really warmly, like way more warm, and I was really feeling quite warm. Not very nice. But then now I feel better. So I wonder if I helped anything there. Could have just been a fluke. Could have been that I didn't sleep well, or I didn't eat the right amounts of foods, and that's what led to my inflammation levels. But there could be this possibility where I increased my body temperature enough that I was able to help fight through this. And one thing I didn't do is I didn't take any anti-inflammatories. So we actually, I think in general, andrographis is really great for immune function if you take it consistently. But when you get sick, it would be good to actually drop it for a while, because it has such a strong inflammation inducing effect. And actually, coming back to LPS, so LPS induces higher levels of cyclooxygenase 2, COX-2. And a lot of these anti-inflammatories we're talking about actually decreases levels of COX-2. And COX-2 seems to have a very important effect on immune function and that oxidative burst, that inflammatory response. So taking COX-2 inhibitors like ibuprofen, and there's actually studies on this too now in the context of COVID, because there is so much research on this now. It's very common when someone gets sick and they're experiencing symptoms of fever. Like a lot of us are very human. We're trying to treat human disorders like pain. So when someone's coming in, clearly in pain, clearly in a fever, which is a good thing, but they're not feeling so nice because of it, we try and give them comfort by giving them an anti-inflammatory.
Or cooling them down.
Or cooling them down.
Yeah.
Well, the cooling down in a medical setting, get cooled down if you need to, because it means your fever is so high you're cooking your brain. Like that's one thing you need to keep in mind here, is that this, like, just like with climate change, you know, when people, climate change isn't real, we're only going up by a half degree a year. That's really catastrophic, half a degree. And half a degree within our body is very catastrophic, can be very catastrophic too. So when we're seeing fevers in ourselves, we're not seeing our temperatures go up at 10 degrees Celsius or so. We're seeing it go up by small amounts. So with that in mind, if your temperature levels go up really like 2 or 3 degrees or something crazy like that, then you can start doing serious damage. So it is, of course, if you are going to lay into the fever, into the body temperature increasing effects, you have to monitor your body temperature, and in general, it's probably good to not really do anything about that and to actually just let everything run its course. So we're coming at this from more of an optimization standpoint, where there are some protocols you can engage in that can help enhance your chances of fighting off the pathogen. But
know that we're not doctors.
We're not doctors, so we're not recommending it, but it is
and
interesting.
We can't give specific medical advice.
Yeah. But what I can recommend is really easy. Don't do anything. Like, you get sick, don't take anti-inflammatories, don't take something like andrographis, don't take any mushrooms, don't take anything like that. Just let it happen.
Let your immune system do what it wants to do.
It's very good at doing what it wants to do. And a lot of the time, now I'm realizing over the years and years and years, when we're talking about immune system when you're sick, we're just talking about symptom management. I'm feeling foggy-headed, I'm feeling inflamed, I'm feeling in pain, I'm in chills, and you do something about that. You're just treating the symptoms, you're not actually increasing your chances. So lean into that uncomfortableness. Trust that your body is doing a good thing by increasing the temperature, by all of this inflammation. It's good, so just let it do its thing. And a really interesting thing there too, and this is something, you know, when we're talking about omega-3 fatty acids like fish oil and stuff like that too, fish oil, DHA levels, for example, are very important when you're recovering from being sick, the resolution of inflammation. But it is also anti-inflammatory, so maybe we can start taking some of our omega-3 fish oils as well the first couple of days. We're not talking about long-term, but like as soon as you get sick, anything that could have anti-inflammatory, antioxidant type of effects, except maybe vitamin C and of course vitamin D and all of those things, which we'll get to very shortly, because those are very important. But you might actually want to stay away from all of that. And that's something I'm going to start experimenting with, because I realize over the years that I've been doing a great job of managing my symptoms and feeling better and being able to just go into work and work at a very low level because my cognitive function is impacted. I'm just not feeling great. and I'm just extending everything.
Mm-hmm.
In a perfect world, and you know, I can do this, I can just go, okay, I'm gonna take 1 or 2 days completely off,
Mm-hmm.
get as sick as humanly possible, lay in bed, slow down my blood flow, just relax, or maybe actually stress myself out a bit. So that's another interesting thing. Even when you get sick, increasing your norepinephrine levels and your stress levels can actually be beneficial. So when we're talking about taking a warm shower, that's great. Maybe at a certain point we also want to take a cold shower.
Yeah.
Because a cold shower can increase our norepinephrine levels. So we could maybe do like a contrast shower.
Mm-hmm.
You could also try not eating for a while. If you're not used to fasting, that could be enough to trigger a small stress response. Or you could try drinking a large amount of caffeine or something like that. Something to trigger a stress response. That can help. But again, watch the Human Labs podcast about immune function and the nervous system. There's some very interesting stuff there.
It's interesting that you talk about all of these behavioral elements of supporting your immune system function or actually dampening your immune system function because for you, because you work from home, managing symptoms can be really important to help you stay productive so that you can continue to work even if your cognitive function isn't where it normally is. But for me, I work with people in person and I have to have a lot of energy because I need to be communicating with people for hours on end. I'm interacting with people in a space. I might be rehearsing with musicians. I'm going to be talking to people. If I get sick, I'm not going to show up to work or to a rehearsal because I don't want to get somebody else sick, but also because I need to be extremely energetic and I need to have all of my cognitive function available so that I can do what I do. But that also means that I might, when I get sick, stay home for a day and then let myself get really quite sick so that I can recover faster and then I can recover all of those qualities that help me to do my job, like being able to perform at a high level with a lot of energy. So based on our lifestyle, we also have different behaviors when we get sick and we have different methods of dealing with sickness. And because of our lifestyle, that means that for me, taking a day or two off can actually help me to achieve what I want to faster, but that's also because my work schedule is more flexible. For someone who has to go into an office or who's working more consistently, you might have a more difficult time letting those symptoms get worse because it's just not practical for you on a daily basis. So all of this to say,
and for most of us, you know, especially being in the Netherlands, we have sometimes the luxury to actually take time off work. And of course, all of us at Nootropics Depot have this ability because we get time off when we're sick, which is really important. But not everyone has that option. And I think especially a lot of Americans, you don't have a lot of time off. So you end up just going to work sick, getting other people sick, kind of stretching out your symptoms with a lot, stretching out your sickness with a lot of symptom management. Because it blew my mind when I moved to the US and you go to like CVS or a pharmacy or anything like that. And if you do that here in the Netherlands, there's like 3 products for a cold. And you can't even buy something like pseudoephedrine or something like that, which now that I think about it, pseudoephedrine boosts norepinephrine levels. So that's actually kind of maybe an interesting one to take when you're sick because it could give you an artificial stress response. But anyways, in the US, there's just rows and rows and rows of stuff that can help with symptom management. And some of this stuff is really beneficial, like combination over-the-counters with dextromethorphan and some acetaminophen for the pain and a nasal decongestant and an antihistamine in there. You get these whole cocktails of things that make you feel great. I've tried a few of them. I'm feeling sick. Drink some of this Tylenol, whatever, PM, AM stuff. Feel great. And then it wears off. You feel awful. But it's because you're managing those symptoms so you're not actually getting any better. So for the future, I think for myself especially, I might actually look at some things that could even enhance that inflammation a little bit. So I was talking about omega-3 fish oils. The counterpart to that is arachidonic acid, or the omega-6 fatty acids, which are important for producing things like prostaglandins, which are inflammatory. So oftentimes arachidonic acid has a bit of a bad reputation because arachidonic acid induces inflammation. But in this scenario, we might actually want to take a bit of arachidonic acid, because those prostaglandins that arachidonic acid is the precursor for are super important for our immune system and are some of the inflammatory mediators that kill intruders. So maybe you actually want to eat like maybe a bit more junk food. Just get some of those inflammatory oils into you to actually exacerbate things that we normally wouldn't want to do, but maybe that McDonald's Happy Meal is a great fit for producing more inflammation. That's of course a little bit ridiculous, but there are other food sources that are high in arachidonic acid, so you could potentially look at eating something that's higher in arachidonic acid. But now we have to talk about sickness behavior. When we get sick, we engage in behavioral patterns, and Huberman again does a great job of going over this, but you've noticed this yourself. Erika is one of those people who, when you get sick, you want more help.
Absolutely.
When I get sick, I don't want help. I want people to kind of stay away from me. I just want to be in my own little space. And that kind of seems to be a 50-50 chance of that happening. And part of that is because of the chemicals that are being generated while we're sick. And a lot of that mimics mood disorders too. So if you look, for example, at people with low mood, they oftentimes have high levels of interleukin-6, which is one of the main pro-inflammatory cytokines. And that goes up as we're sick. And over time, when we're first sick, we don't get the IL-6 levels increasing all too much in the brain. But as we get sicker and sicker, and that goes on for a long period of time, and our interleukin-6 levels go up, then it ends up making it into the brain, and that can actually lower our mood and cognitive function. And I definitely noticed that. So the first couple of days I was fine. And then I think on like day 5 or so, I started getting kind of depressed feeling, and I couldn't focus, and I just wasn't having it. So this is really not normal behavior for me, and I felt very helpless, like, oh, I'm just useless, and just felt generally sad. And that could be part of the interleukin-6 levels going up and the sickness behavior where for some reason our nervous system is primed to engage us in different behavioral patterns, which Huberman discusses in much better detail than I am. There's a great section about sickness behavior, but it is interesting to look at what happens there and what our bodies do. We get lethargic, we want to lay in bed, we don't want to go out into the world as much. Some people want to get taken care of, some people want to be taken care of. Maybe that has a genetic element to it as well, where maybe people who need more help are maybe not as good at passing on an infection. I don't know. That's getting really off the rails there. But there is definitely some interesting things there, part of which is decreased appetite, which maybe if fasting does indeed enhance norepinephrine levels in most people who are not used to fasting, then that could be a good way of increasing immune function to actually fight off the infection.
Well, that's good to know, because oftentimes when I get sick, I have very little appetite, and I really find it difficult to eat. In fact, I find it annoying sometimes because I just don't want to. So maybe there's a little bit more justification for not forcing myself to have food when I'm really not feeling well and I don't have an appetite. That being said, on the recovery side, after I've been sick, if I haven't eaten enough, then I can feel really weak, and that's also not great for recovery. So of course there's also a balance there. But it's interesting to consider that a bit of nausea or a smaller appetite could actually be immune function related and not just behavioral, or not just a preference at that point when you are sick.
Absolutely. But one thing to keep in mind there is if you're not eating enough, you're also not getting probably enough minerals, salt, things like that, which are very important because we also end up burning through more micronutrients while we're sick, electrolytes included. So we don't have our electrolyte product out yet. Hopefully we will by the next time the cold and flu season is around. But I think, especially if you're not eating a whole lot while you're sick, it is important to get those electrolytes in.
Mm-hmm.
Those are going to have a beneficial effect. And a lot of those electrolytes also aren't particularly antioxidant or anti-inflammatory either. So they're probably okay in general to be taking just from the start.
So we've been talking a lot about what happens when we get sick. What happens the day that we start to feel sick or the following couple of days, and what to do when we know that we've got a cold or we've got a fever or maybe we have the flu and the sickness is unavoidable, we're in it. But something that we haven't talked about so much yet is what to do to prevent getting sick in the first place, and how we can actually boost our immune system and how we can bolster our immune system to keep us healthier throughout the year, especially during the wintertime. And while we don't want to be reducing our immune system function while we're sick, if we can boost our immune system when we're not sick, this can help us just stay healthier in general. And there are some things like anti-inflammatories and mushrooms and a lot of different botanicals that can actually help us to get sick less often and help just our general immune function. And then there's also behavior that we can do, which is kind of the opposite side of the coin, which can also help us have a better and more effective immune system. And one of those things certainly is sleep, to have a healthy sleep schedule.
And also while you're sick, get enough sleep while you're sick, get enough sleep normally, regulate your stress levels normally, because like we're talking about, having increased inflammation, increased oxidation, increased stress levels, lack of food intake, all of that could be beneficial to further fuel the processes that are going on to help get rid of the intruders. But we don't want that all the time. We want to manage our inflammation and oxidation system so that it's always primed, that when we go into this hyperinflammation, hyperoxidation states, that we can also deal with the potential damaging effects of that. So having enough glutathione is really important, because basically what's happening is you are driving oxidation and inflammation in areas of the body, and then in other areas of the body you don't have this inflammation and oxidation, and you have to balance them out. So like inside of a cell, inside some of these immune cells, you could have these oxidative bursts happening, but then around it you want to protect the environment from stuff coming out of those immune cells and inducing inflammation and oxidation. So taking things like glutathione, vitamin C, zinc, all of those minerals all year round can be beneficial there too. And vitamin D plays a big role here too. So vitamin D is very important for our immune function. And again, during the winter months, our core body temperature is probably a little bit lower, which makes us more susceptible, but we get most of our vitamin D from sunlight, and you need about 20 minutes of full sun exposure. Well, you need 20 minutes with 40% of your body exposed to UVB radiation. So also if it's a cloudy day and you're walking around like I am now with long sleeves, then that's not 40%. I've got my hands in my face. That's maybe 5%, 2% of my total body mass. So definitely in the winter months when you're walking around in warm clothes, oftentimes I'm wearing a hat, gloves, shoes. So the only thing, and I have a beard of course, so in the winter months I'm basically got this.
That's exposed to the sun, which would mean that you only have that small amount of skin which is actually going to be taking in vitamin D. However, if you do have a chance
not taking in. There's no vitamin D in the sun. We are producing vitamin D in our skin from sun. Do you want to keep that in there?
This might be the very first time that anyone has ever told me that. Truly. Vitamin D comes from the sun. That was how I always understood it. I mean, now that you say it, it sounds kind of ridiculous, but this is maybe a really important point to actually keep in the podcast, even though it might seem outlandish that someone would think that. But tell me then how vitamin D is actually working, because this is very much news to me.
And if it's news to you, it might be news to a lot of people.
Could be. So vitamin D does not come from the sun.
Well, it comes from the sun.
Okay.
But there's no vitamin D in solar rays. So you're not walking around just catching vitamin D with your hands
Okay,
or
so,
your skin.
So how does it work then?
So you get the UVB.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the waves in sunlight. You have
Mm-hmm.
UVA, UVB. I think there's even UVC, but mostly what we're concerned with is UVB. It can also give you sunburn and things like that. But one thing that UVB can do is it has an interaction with cholesterol in our skin.
Okay.
And when UVB interacts with cholesterol in the skin, then we produce vitamin D.
We produce vitamin D.
We produce from cholesterol.
Okay.
So we have cholesterol,
Mm-hmm.
sunlight, they're coming together in our skin,
Mm-hmm.
and now we have vitamin D.
And now I have a question for you about vitamin D. When we take our vitamin D tablets, where is that coming from? From what source? And how does that work?
Sheepskin.
Sheepskin.
So, and this sounds pretty gross probably, and is one of the reasons why our vitamin D is not vegan.
Okay.
I think it's vegetarian. Yeah, it's vegetarian. But basically, you take the oils that are on the skin of sheep. You call it sheep lanosterol, I believe.
Okay.
You take that fat, and in that fat are the precursors that you use to make vitamin D3.
Okay.
Now, certain plants, like mushrooms, for example, when they're exposed to UVB radiation, they can make vitamin D2. Vitamin D3 is the preferred form because vitamin D3 absorbs better. Vitamin D2 still definitely has its place, and we get a little bit through maybe some mushrooms that have been grown under UV light. But you also get it from different animal species because, of course, they're walking around in the sunshine.
Yeah.
And they're doing the same process. So animal meat will contain vitamin D. So we do get small amounts of vitamin D from our diet.
Okay.
Salmon, for example, is a pretty rich source of vitamin D. But in general, our main source of vitamin D is the vitamin D that's being synthesized in our skin.
From cholesterol.
From cholesterol mediated by UVB.
Okay.
So, as your exposure to UVB starts to decrease, and in the Netherlands, for example, in a lot of Nordic countries, it's twofold. It's not even that extreme here, but when was it getting dark? Like 4 p.m. During kind of the winter solstice. I think it's still getting dark at around 4:35 p.m. now. And it's not getting light till like 9 a.m. Yeah. So you have this very short period actually from 9 a.m. till about 4 p.m. while you're indoors at work usually, where you can have a bit of sun exposure. But again, it's really cold and frigid most of the time, so you're probably wearing gloves and a hat, and you only have very small amount of skin available.
Or you're inside, in which case you're not getting any kind of sun contact.
Correct. And I think that's actually really interesting about Arizona, because in the winter, when you are getting a lot of sun exposure, it's cold enough where you're wearing long sleeves and sometimes even a hat. So there is a lot of sun, but you're not exposing a lot of your body to the sun. And in the summer, it's usually so hot, you also stay inside. So even though Arizona is a very sunny place, I think there's actually a lot of people who have really severe vitamin D deficiencies. One of my colleagues actually was one of our current colleagues had quite severe vitamin D deficiency, partially because of this. And that's really something we noticed in Arizona. You just kind of stay inside all of the time. There's a very short period where you're actually outside. But here it's important. In the summer, we're getting a lot of vitamin D. I still take vitamin D during the summer, but lower doses. And then in the winter, I start ramping up my vitamin D dose. So in the winter, we take 1.5 tablets of the vitamin D3 MK7 formulation. We really like that one. That works well. We should also be getting our vitamin D levels tested, but if you just think about it logically, our main source of vitamin D is the sun. I'm really not coming into contact basically with any sun for the last couple of months. I can't remember the last time I just sat in the sun with skin exposed. So those levels are dropping. So a good way to prevent yourself from getting sick, so here's another interesting thing about vitamin D. Vitamin D actually isn't that important. So vitamin D3 in our liver turns into 25 hydroxy vitamin D. And then 25 hydroxy vitamin D can turn into like 125 hydroxy vitamin D3, which I think that's correct, but it's calcitriol. And then the other one, 25-hydroxy vitamin D, is calcifediol, I believe. Those are the actual names for it. But the important thing is that there is a vitamin D receptor. That vitamin D receptor has a lot of impact on our overall immune function and general health. And it's the hormone versions, so the 25-hydroxy and the 1,2,5-hydroxy vitamin D, calcitriol. Those are the hormone forms, and those are the forms that actually end up binding to the vitamin D receptor and producing their beneficial effects. So it's also how efficient are you at turning vitamin D into 25-hydroxy vitamin D. And it does seem that when you get sick, you actually have a decreased ability to generate 25-hydroxy vitamin D. So that's kind of interesting. So that would mean that if you were to take very high doses of vitamin D when you get sick, even though you never take vitamin D throughout the year, then it wouldn't matter, because what's really important is that you're building up those hormone levels, the 25-hydroxy and the calcitriol levels over time. But that takes some time, especially because vitamin D is also, I believe, fat soluble, so it takes a lot longer to clear out of your system, but also to build up. So it's important, like Erika said, what can you do to prevent yourself from getting sick? It is important to keep up on those micronutrients that you will need when you're sick, but are not necessarily going to be able to boost up in a reasonable amount of time when you get sick. So one of those is zinc, as we talked about earlier. Maybe if you take a zinc acetate lozenge, and there is some research on this, then yes, you can boost your zinc levels in areas that matter briefly, and then that can prevent you from getting sicker or sick in general. But if you just top up your zinc levels and you're not running a lot of people like to talk about zinc deficiency or vitamin D deficiency. Not a lot of people are severely, like genuinely deficient in a lot of these things, but we're just not getting optimal levels. So we like to call it insufficiencies. A lot of people have vitamin D, zinc, magnesium insufficiencies. We're not taking in enough through our food. So topping those up with supplements is very beneficial all year round. So just topping up your micronutrients. So zinc is a good one. Magnesium is a good one, because magnesium does play a big role in the immune system too. And the B vitamins are very important. They work as cofactors in many different processes related to the immune function. So definitely topping up your B vitamin levels. And a lot of people have enough of these B vitamins, but we go through them a lot. So because they're being used as cofactors, we're burning through these B vitamins, and a lot of them are water soluble, so we end up excreting them quite rapidly through our urine. So, which you see if you take Infinity for the first time, you will, well, actually, when you take it for the first time, especially if you don't get a whole lot of riboflavin, you don't actually seem to have the highlighter yellow urine. But after a while, once maybe your riboflavin levels are at a proper level, then you start excreting more riboflavin through your urine, and then it becomes a highlighter green, because riboflavin is a very powerful dye as well. So those B vitamins are very important because they're being used as cofactors in a lot of these processes. And then vitamin C, of course, is important, but again, more in maintaining adequate levels rather than taking shitloads of vitamin C as you get sick, where there is some evidence for it, but it's quite inconclusive. So, and a lot of this stuff is quite inconclusive. There aren't a lot of magic pills out there that will just get you better when you get sick. You need to take precautions beforehand in a more preventative manner. So taking all of these supplements, sleeping enough, eating your probiotics, because that's another thing. If you eat probiotics when you're sick, it doesn't really matter, because it's the long-term effects of those short-chain fatty acids and the effects those have on different cells throughout the body and the mucous membranes and all of that, and just building it up over time. It's kind of like you enroll yourself into a marathon, and you just sit on your ass all year round, and then you go do the marathon. You're not going to get very far in a marathon because you're not trained. And if on that day you start training, it doesn't matter, because you needed to train all year round to be able to run the marathon properly. And it's the same thing here. we want to consistently be supporting our immune system. And we don't want to ever really be in this situation where we're taking large amounts of something to try and get better, because most of the time when we're taking large amounts of something, when we're sick, we're actually just suppressing symptoms and we're not doing a whole lot to actually help ourselves. So taking precautions like making sure your gut microbiome is in the best shape ever, that's really important. So whether that is with various supplements like berberine, resveratrol, cystanche tubulosa is a good one, because cystanche tubulosa has been found to actually increase the ability of those bacteria to create short-chain fatty acids, specifically butyrates. That's really important. So taking a lot of these supplements that can modulate microbiome levels. So my favorites are cystanche and resveratrol. I take those two together. And that's actually something, Erika, you don't take at the time when you were getting sick.
Mm-hmm.
You were not taking cystanche, you were not taking resveratrol, and
Yeah.
I was taking both. So that's another factor to include in, perhaps that's why I didn't initially get sick, was because those do have beneficial effects on my gut microbiome. We are both eating fermented foods, but that might have given me just slightly more of an edge. So that's those would be some interesting supplements to look at, but definitely dialing your food consumption, making sure you're getting those fibers and starches necessary for creating those short chain fatty acids, making sure you get enough omega-3 fatty acids all year round, making sure you get enough vitamin D, zinc, magnesium, the B vitamins, maybe even a little bit of vitamin E. Vitamin A is another important one that we don't carry, but we might in the future because it is interesting. And some of these other minerals that are just important. So making sure all of your bases are covered, you're sleeping properly, you're eating a varied diet. It's not too high in anything. I know these days it's really popular to go, I'm going to cut out all carbs and just do fats and proteins. That can have its benefits, but high-fat diets are also associated sometimes with lower immune function, and a lot of those carbohydrates we're trying to avoid these days for some reason are also very high in fibers and starches that you need to produce these short-chain fatty acids. So that's also a little bit silly. For example, potatoes are a good source of these starches, especially I guess when you cool down the potatoes. I don't really know why that's the case. I still have to look into that. But a lot of these starchy foods that we consider as unhealthy are actually prebiotics. They're just prebiotic bombs. So a potato could be that, and a potato also contains a lot of potassium, so that can have a beneficial effect on immune function too. So basically just eat healthy. Exercise enough, because exercise enhances your norepinephrine levels. That's good for immune function, but also just exercise in general has an adaptive effect on our body. So we want to be exercising enough, we want to be eating enough, we want to be sleeping enough, we want to have our stress under control, we want to cover all of those micronutrients, and then we can get into some interesting supplements too. So this was another thing during the early days of COVID. We kind of looked at what can we do for ourselves as prevention stacks. Again, this is not something you should really take as gospel.
It's not medical advice.
It's not medical advice. But there were definitely a lot of research studies coming out, and we could think of ways that we could have a preventative effect. So one of those was andrographis. It has an effect on viral replication. It limits viral replication. And then also supplements like hesperidin, which act as a zinc ionophore. So that basically means that together with, so hesperidin and zinc together, hesperidin acting as a zinc ionophore does a good job of getting zinc inside of the cell. And that's actually where we need zinc for its effects on immune function. So that was a nice way to shuttle zinc into the cells. And then we had some other supplements in the mix, like Nigella sativa can generally increase overall immune function and also adaptive immune function, and that's something we haven't talked a whole lot about, adaptive immune function, and that's a lot more difficult, but so we won't talk a whole lot about supplements that you can take for that, but know that a lot of the general immune enhancing supplements will have a beneficial effect on both the innate and the adaptive immune system, and will provide a big picture effect. But again, I think the most important thing for overall immune function is just to get those micronutrients in. So focus on the basics, focus on more of the behavioral stuff, and then look at some of the mushrooms. So mushrooms are super popular. Erika's a huge fan now of the mushroom magic matcha.
Yeah.
And we were taking mushroom magic matcha while we were sick too. I think
Yes.
it helped, partially because if we look at that more nervous system related effect of norepinephrine levels going up and that being beneficial for immune function, tiger milk mushroom seems to have a bit of a norepinephrine-like effect, perhaps through its NGF mechanisms. And caffeine has a norepinephrine boosting effect, and the green tea catechins like EGCG have an effect on COMT, an enzyme that has an effect on dopamine and norepinephrine levels too. So all of that together, it's mild, but if you look at the stimulating effects of mushroom magic matcha, it is more than you would expect from a 75 milligram dose of caffeine. So there is perhaps a bit more of a norepinephrine boosting effect there. Perhaps it definitely made me feel better when I was drinking it. It kind of gave me back my cognitive function, but didn't really get rid of a lot of those physical symptoms, which is good because it means it's probably not super inflammation dampening and oxidation dampening, although definitely the mushrooms in there do have these effects. But, and this is part of the reason also why we went with full spectrum mushrooms, so non-extracts, is they contain a lot of beta-glucans and polysaccharides and other starches and fibers that can be fermented by our gut microbiome to create these short-chain fatty acids. And this is something all mushrooms have in common with each other. They all have beta-glucans, and these beta-glucans are these carbohydrate type compounds that can be fermented by our gut microbiome to produce short-chain fatty acids. So when we're looking at mushrooms, we're basically looking at prebiotic supplements that can deliver beta-glucan levels. And we actually took this a step further. Well, we didn't. First, it was the company behind Epicor that basically took yeast, and the yeast cell walls have a lot of beta-glucans. So when you process the yeast and you do some fermentation steps there, you get a really interesting high beta-glucan product that can have beneficial effects on immune function. And actually really interesting about Epicor, the reason they found out Epicor was beneficial for humans was because they were using a different version of Epicor as an animal feed. And in the factory that this animal feed was being made, and they did know, by the way, that it had an immune boosting effects on the animals that they were giving it to. That's why they were giving them this version of Epicor, because animals, just like us, also get sick. But they noticed that the people in the plants processing all of this animal-grade Epicor in very large amounts, they were barely getting sick. So then they did trials on humans with Epicor, and they realized they weren't getting as sick either. And part of the reason is because of the beta-glucans, which are acting in the gut as a prebiotic. And that's something the manufacturer of Epicor also says. It acts as a good prebiotic. And it also has an effect on immunoglobulin A, I believe, or E or A. And that is in your mucous membranes in your mouth, or in your nose and in your mouth, and that can have a preventative effect too. So it can kind of act as a first line of defense. So getting some of these beta-glucan kind of prebiotic type compounds, either from Epicor and then our own functional yeast extract, or some of these mushrooms, but basically looking at kind of a prebiotic mix. And I think the Mushroom Magic line, because we are going to come out with a lot more in the future, those are very interesting beta-glucan sources, because you're getting quite a lot, because there are 4 mushrooms in there at pretty much full doses. So it's like taking 4 separate mushroom supplements, which means that in general you're getting a lot of beta-glucans, and a lot of these mushrooms also contain secondary metabolites that have direct immune stimulating effects. And most of the mushrooms do, and also green tea extract has this effect, and caffeine can even have an immune stimulating effect. So I think that's an interesting one just to take daily if you are a caffeine user and you're not drinking coffee and you want a caffeine source that also has this good prebiotic effect and a good effect on overall immune function, then I think the Mushroom Magic line of drinks, of which now we only have the matcha, is a really interesting pathway to look at. And another interesting thing, there's a company called Seed Probiotic. I think they're doing some really cool stuff with probiotics. And one of the prebiotics they ended up including was a pomegranate extract. So I didn't realize this, but the punicolagens in pomegranate extract and some of the polysaccharides in there actually also act as prebiotics. So they're using a pomegranate extract as a prebiotic, and they have some research on that too. We offer a pomegranate extract that's quite potent, and that could have some interesting prebiotic effects too, and oxidation regulating effects, which again, throughout most of the year, we want to keep inflammation and oxidation low, which means that when we do need it, it can also explode and get crazy out of control and kill everything that we don't want to be there, but then also keep everything around it safe. So
in that case, tart cherry would also be a good supplement to be taking
absolutely
year-round as a preventative measure for reducing inflammation and keeping your immune system healthy.
And something like cyanidin 3-glucoside, for example, that could help. There was some discussion there about could cyanidin 3-glucoside actually make you a little bit more susceptible to getting sick recently on Reddit. I can't remember exactly what the mechanism was. But then I ended up saying, hey, I was taking cyanidin 3-glucoside and you weren't. And
yes.
You were getting sick and I wasn't, but then I did eventually end up getting sick. But potentially there is some nice, well, actually, potentially there is some research showing that cyanidin 3-glucoside has mild immune boosting properties. But I think just generally keeping oxidation and inflammation low throughout the year is a good strategy. In addition to, of course, keeping up your micronutrients. And then other mushrooms like the ganoderic acids, for example, they can have quite profound inflammation dampening effects, but they can also stimulate various immune cells to do their function. So if you look at a lot of these immune boosters, and you know this is already getting to be quite a long podcast because there is so much to discuss. If I was really going to go and discuss every single cell in detail, we'd be here for 24 hours. So I won't do that to you. There's a lot of information to discuss here. It's a very complex system. So we will probably come back and do another episode on some other aspects of the immune system. But for now, I think the real important thing to look at is just prebiotics, micronutrients, lifestyle, and diet choices are all very important for preventing yourself from getting sick. And some of these supplements can have a beneficial effect. So like some of these ganoderic acids, other compounds, like I was talking about, for example, boswellia and curcumin having potentially introduced or made the infection progress for me because of their anti-inflammatory effects. But throughout the year, those are generally positive for your overall immune function because it is stimulating all of these cells. And of course, we also want to stimulate our adaptive immune system. So I think that's really the missing link. We can talk a lot about the innate immune system and prevent ourselves from getting sick from novel infections, things we've never encountered before. But of course, our adaptive immune system is also really important because most of the things we're getting in contact with, maybe we've already fought it off and we never actually got sick enough, but we still have this imprint and we still have this adaptive immune system response. So when we come into contact with this pathogen again, we can fight it off. So it is important to support our adaptive immune system too. And if you look at all of these micronutrients we mentioned, those are very important for maintaining proper adaptive immune system function too. So the two categories are interchangeable. But I do think it would be interesting to do another episode specifically on the adaptive immune system. We could probably talk about it for just as long, but I think that's a very important part of the system to boost as well. And it can be boosted with various immune stimulating mushrooms and botanicals. And that's kind of, if you look at our immune support formulation, the way we formulated it was to have defense and attackers in there. So if you look at something like turkey tail mushroom can actually induce some of that inflammation, can ramp up the immune response so much you might actually end up getting a little bit sicker. palmitoyl ethanolamide does the same thing. So we call those kind of attackers. So when you're sick, those come in and they attack. But even when just generally they won't have that a negative effect per se, it will still be a beneficial immune boosting effect. But if you take palmitoyl ethanolamide and turkey tail together when you're getting sick, that can also help. And then some of the other things in there are more preventative, boosting our innate immune response, our adaptive immune response. So we have some zinc in there, of course, turkey tail mushroom, red reishi mushroom, palmitoyl ethanolamide, but also oleamide, because the endocannabinoid system plays a huge role in modulating immune function too. So dampening it and boosting it and keeping it all balanced. So a lot of immune cells actually carry cannabinoid receptors on them too. CB2 being a really important one. So we have a lot of CB2 agonists that can then also have a beneficial immune system response. So beta-caryophyllene, for example. And when we were sick, we were taking a lot of supercritical holy basil. And that was dampening the symptoms quite a bit. But I don't feel like it was necessarily dampening it enough where it was interfering with my normal immune response. Like I still felt kind of inflamed. I felt a little bit better. And there are definitely some compounds in there, like beta-caryophyllene, that has an effect on CB2 receptors, that definitely has an immune modulating effect. So holy basil is definitely a famous one for its immune boosting effects too. So
in that case, Rethel would also be one, because
Rethel would be one, yeah.
Super high levels of beta-caryophyllene.
Tetrahydromagnolol would also be. So there's a lot of interesting supplements to look at, but a lot of them definitely are also focused on our gut microbiome. And I think over time, and the more we learn about the gut microbiome, it will become more and more important. So maybe we should do a whole episode about our gut microbiome. I would also love to develop more gut microbiome specific products, because I think that's kind of where the future lies, also for cognitive enhancement and immune function. A lot of it can be traced back to your gut and the foods we eat. So that's why we're drinking our kombucha and our
sauerkraut.
Sauerkraut, yeah. So
I would love to do an episode just on the gut, because I think it's something that has become really popular to talk about, but I certainly don't know anything about the gut microbiome, about bacteria, healthy bacteria. The only thing that I know is that kombucha and kimchi and sauerkraut are really tasty. They're also getting more popular, and when I'm eating more fermented foods, my mood is generally better, my digestion is better, and it certainly has really good immune boosting properties. But some of those effects we can't necessarily perceive, but we know that they are having a beneficial effect. And that's something where when we talk about getting sick, we can feel these responses of our immune system in our body. So it's a perceptible experience, and we might feel ourselves getting hot, we might feel ourselves getting achy, and then if we take an anti-inflammatory, that changes. So being sick is a really good example to use, because we know what it feels like to be sick. When we're taking immune boosting supplements year round, we might not necessarily feel them perceptibly on an everyday basis, but we can for sure measure over time that we're getting sick less than if we weren't taking those supplements. And that's definitely the case for us compared to people who we work with, or even family members who aren't taking supplements as often. We don't get sick very much, even though we can often be exposed to lots of different kinds of pathogens or bacteria. We go out to shows, we're interacting with people a lot, but we're not necessarily getting as sick at the same frequency as someone who wouldn't be taking these immune boosting supplements.
Yeah, so we don't drive a car, so if we're going to the city or we're going anywhere, we're taking public transit, we're in trains. Ideally, you would probably wear a mask all the time, and you probably just wouldn't get sick.
And there are still people, especially here, older people who I see when they're going for a walk or when they're out and about, they're wearing a mask when they're sick. And it's certainly way more common in countries in Asia, and has been for many, many years, that when people are sick, that they will wear a mask to prevent other people from getting sick, or to prevent themselves from getting sick too.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. Like, if you're sick, stay at home. don't go out into the world because you are going to infect people, and then it might actually come back to you. And if your adaptive immune system isn't great, then that infection you pass to someone might come back and bite you again a month later or something like that. So it is important to, if we're getting sick, even if it's a cold, stay at home.
Yes, but of course, if you have small kids, if you have kids who are in school, some of that is just not preventable at all. Or if you happen to be a teacher, or if you work in a restaurant or service industry where you're just interacting with people as a part of your job, it might not be possible to do that. But that's all the more reason to be taking these supplements that are going to be boosting your immune system and helping you fight off those infections or sicknesses so that you don't get sick in the first place.
Yeah. And I have to say, I never got really, really sick, even in my pre-supplement days. But I definitely got sick like 3 or 4 times a year. And I'm getting sick like once or twice a year, and it's less severe. So I definitely think all of the supplements are helping. But it is, I think, the more basic interventions that are having the biggest effect, like the Infinity, the Infinicy, the glutathione that we're taking every day to keep our glutathione levels at a proper level, the zinc, the vitamin D, preventing some of these things from going out of whack so that when things do go wrong, we have those defenses. And I think recently the area I've been going wrong in is being a bit more of afraid of the symptoms and taking things to make my life more comfortable. And now I know, especially after doing research for this podcast and for the blog, that in the future I will just be laying into it more and seeing if that helps, because I definitely seem to be stretching out my sick time, even though it's less severe. I've definitely not had the flu in probably like 10 or 20 years. Probably like 15 or 20 years from the last time that I can really remember badly having the flu. Maybe more like 10 years now that I think about it, which coincides kind of with the time I was starting to take things like magnesium, very basic things. But I'm really having a hard time thinking back to the last time like I had a serious flu. And you? Yeah,
I have had the flu somewhat frequently over the past couple of years, but again, I think lifestyle has a big part of this.
And keep in mind that Erika is a much more recent adopter of supplements, because you were highly skeptical of supplements, and you weren't taking supplements for a long time. And I think only in like the last 4 years or so have you really consistently been taking your supplements.
For sure.
And I think part of that actually started with COVID.
Yeah.
Where we both got a lot more serious about supplementation. I was always serious about supplementation, which is of course why I'm in the position I am now. But yeah, for you it's been a bit more recent. So for me it really has been like for the last 10 years. I've been more than 10 years now. I've been taking supplements since I was about 18, and I'm about to turn 30. So it has been a long time. Actually, I think I've been taking ginkgo biloba even earlier, like when I was 16 or 17 or so, which might have, it definitely has some immune boosting properties too. So
behaviorally though, it's interesting to compare that. For me, I'm a musician, I'm also really social, and I've worked in a lot of different restaurants and service type of roles where I'm interacting with lots of people for many, many hours a day. I'm sure that that's contributing to the fact that I'm getting sick more often. But it could also be contributing to my really strong and powerful immune system, because over the years, after getting sick this many times, I think that my immune system is really strong to the point that I can recover from something quite quickly. You, on the other hand, aren't in these kind of group environments quite as much, definitely now that we're here in the Netherlands, but historically speaking, I was involved in all kinds of group activities, big music ensembles, interacting with lots and lots of people indoors all the time, almost every single day. And for you, that's been quite different. So we can trace a lot of our illness history based on our behavior, but then we can also think about the way that our body reacts to illness based on our behavior. And what we hope that you learn from this podcast is that the immune system, it's complex, but it's also something that we can optimize and use to our advantage. And sometimes that means dealing with a little bit of discomfort or, no pain, no gain mentality, because ultimately we want to be strong so that we can fight against the threats that are coming into our bodies, the bacteria, the pathogens, these kinds of things. And by taking supplements and by supporting our immune system, we can be more strong and more reactive to these kinds of outside threats. And that's the whole point of boosting the immune system.
And if you think about it, it is remarkable what the immune system achieves, because we're coming into contact with not a few hundred or a few thousand or a few billion. We're coming into contact with trillions and trillions. I don't even know what comes above the trillion mark.
Bajillion.
Bajillion. We're coming into contact with bajillions of bacteria, viruses, pathogens, all sorts of nasty stuff in our environment that we are consistently warding off. If you consider that in 365 days, only a couple of days out of those 365 we're getting sick. So it's quite remarkable what we do. I think we need to trust our immune system. Our immune system does its job. We shouldn't necessarily get in the way as much with symptom management in the beginning. A little bit later, when we're recovering, start taking more omega-3 fatty acids. Start taking those anti-inflammatories. Like, let's say at day 3 or 4, when you're recovering. Start taking all of that then. Enhance the recovery process. But when you get sick, or right in that period where you feel yourself getting sick, slow down with the anti-inflammatories. Slow down with the antioxidants. Exercise maybe a bit more. Expose yourself to heat. Go into a sauna or something if you're not having a fever, of course. But
if you're not contagious.
Well, yeah, I'm considering people might have their own sauna.
That would be nice.
We don't. But maybe if you're in Finland or something, then you probably have your own sauna. But you take a hot bath if you have a bath. Take a hot shower, whatever. Go for a run in way too warm of clothing. Heat yourself up a bit. Lay into it a bit, and then take those supplements throughout the year. But supplements, I think, are important for immune function, especially the basic micronutrients. But you're going to be fine even without those supplements. What we're really trying to do here is to optimize. And I think the optimization should really be coming from your gut and from your inflammatory and oxidative system, and making sure you have all of those components necessary to endure a high inflammatory oxidative storm and be able to come out of that unscathed. Because this is really, we're talking about this in normal healthy people, but when you're not talking about this in normal healthy people, this cytokine storm, these high levels of inflammation and oxidation in people who have low levels of glutathione, for example, they're not going to be able to counteract the negative effects of that oxidative burst. So then that oxidative burst is going to damage lung tissue, for example. So it is really those processes that end up killing the pathogens also can end up killing you. So that's an important distinction, that we're talking about this in healthy people. If you do, of course, have a medical disorder or anything like that, don't do anything we're saying here, because your outcomes may be very different. If you are an alcoholic and your glutathione levels are low, or you have
an immune
disorder, or you have a lung disorder. So yeah, as always, all of these supplements are generally for healthy individuals and a supplement to a healthy lifestyle. So definitely for immune boosting effects, that's really important, because there are a lot of immune related issues, autoimmune issues, or like we talked about, lifestyle issues that really change this picture quite dramatically, especially when you start taking into account things like glutathione being depleted in certain conditions, and that really changes the thing, because what we're talking about is basically letting the damage run its course a little bit in order to extinguish basically the threat. But you can basically only do that when you are a healthy individual and your immune system is working how it should and everything is fine. Because, of course, these immune events can produce damage. And one of the main things you see is lung damage, which of course is why a lot of these respiratory supplements are quite popular too. Tiger milk mushroom is a big one. Glutathione, N-acetylcysteine. That's one thing we haven't really talked about, but I think N-acetylcysteine is a really interesting one.
I wanted to bring that up earlier when we were talking about it, because I've been taking N-acetylcysteine recently, not because of feeling sick, but because I find that it actually just gives me really nice energy and a mood boost.
But we started when you were sick.
Yes.
So if you want to...
Yeah, so we started when I was feeling quite under the weather, and I'm taking this thing called Flomasil, and it's just one of those fizzy tablets that you drop into water.
Which we have N-acetylcysteine too, by the way.
Yes,
we just didn't have any, so we got some from the local pharmacy. So this is a 600 milligram dose of N-acetylcysteine, and I believe our N-acetylcysteine capsules are 500 milligrams.
Mm-hmm. So when I was taking this for my cold that I had, I noticed that it certainly helped with my mucus, like it helped thin my mucus, it made it easier to swallow, to kind of get through the mucus.
And that's what N-acetylcysteine basically does. It can break the sulfur bonds in our mucus. So mucus can be quite different, and mucus can get very tight, or it's a little bit more liquidy. And we've experienced both types of mucus, like, you know, when you're coughing out like chunks of coagulated mucus, versus if you're like losing a lot of mucus through your nose,
or your nose
like
is running
and that's like thin mucus. So there's different types of mucus, and oftentimes if you have this highly coagulated mucus in your respiratory system, that can feel not so nice, and can be an aspect of coughing and things like that too. And acetylcysteine breaks those sulfur bonds and thins out your mucus.
And it also happened to give me a really nice energy and mood boost, because even when I was feeling sick, I would take this for the mucus benefits, but then I noticed, hey, I'm feeling a little bit of an uptick in my energy. And so after the fact, when I've been feeling like I need some extra kind of sustenance or some extra boost, I've been taking the N-acetylcysteine, this Flomasil, and it still is giving me a nice energy boost. It's a little bit calming also, and I find that it also relaxes my stomach, which feels particularly relevant because we've been talking a lot about the gut-brain axis and how your gut has a lot to do with whether you get sick and how sick you actually get.
Absolutely. And NAC is quite an interesting compound for the fact why I really like it is that it can rapidly boost glutathione levels, much more rapidly than glutathione itself. So if you have been kind of slacking on your daily, yearly glutathione supplementation, then taking N-acetylcysteine would be a good way to boost overall glutathione levels. And there is also some research showing that N-acetylcysteine has beneficial effects on immune function and infection rates. So that is definitely an interesting one. It is a strong antioxidant, so in one sense it is good to avoid maybe at the start. But when I was not feeling great on Sunday, I took the hot shower. I also took some N-acetylcysteine, and I do think I felt better. So even though it is an antioxidant, it is an antioxidant mainly because it's producing glutathione levels, and that glutathione is important for helping us deal with the oxidative damage that is being produced due to our immune response. So taking N-acetylcysteine, I think, is still beneficial even at the outset. But of course it is also degrading your mucus and things like that, so depending on your mucus acting as kind of a filter, there might be an impact there. So how great is it to be taking these higher doses of N-acetylcysteine all the time? But I definitely can recommend that if you are feeling under the weather, and especially if you're building up some mucus and it feels thick and you're having a hard time expelling it, N-acetylcysteine is very nice to thin out that mucus. And it made me feel better. I don't know if it made me recover quicker, but it definitely made me feel a little bit better, and I think it's an interesting option, and I'll definitely have some N-acetylcysteine from Nootropics Depot at home. But those fizzy tablets are kind of nice because they dissolve and it's a nice drink, and you're staying hydrated, and I think that's an important thing. Just stay hydrated, let it run its course, and try those preventative measures. So in terms of those preventative measures,
we could talk a little bit about stacks, and there's just one small thing I wanted to mention. Another reason why I've been taking the N-acetylcysteine more frequently is because we're currently out of Andrographis paniculata, which is our main respiratory health and immune health supplement that's in our stack. And we've been out of it for almost 2 weeks now. And for the last 2 weeks, I've noticed that I've had more like thicker mucus, and I wake up in the morning with a little bit more congestion. So I'm not sure if I'm getting sick or if I'm also reacting to the fact that we don't have Andrographis in our stack. But regardless, taking the N-acetylcysteine is helping to kind of balance out those symptoms that I'm experiencing, which I think is coming from the fact that Andrographis isn't in our stack. So,
and I think one interesting thing to point out too with Andrographis, we mentioned that Andrographis is not great to take right as you're getting sick because it has a strong anti-inflammatory effect. However, if you are an individual that is more susceptible to the inflammation effects that your immune system is putting out, and that's going to produce a significant amount of damage.
Mean just in daily life?
Just like when you're getting sick.
Okay, yeah.
Well, just in daily life, like maybe you are more susceptible to inflammation. Maybe you don't have the tools necessary to take care of all of that inflammation and oxidation properly, like if your glutathione levels are low or you have low levels of B vitamins, etc. You're less capable of dealing with this inflammatory and oxidative storm. Then, in that scenario, it might actually be beneficial to be taking Andrographis as you're getting sick. And there is a lot of evidence for this too. There's been a lot of research on Andrographis in COVID times. There's plenty of research you can read on it. It seems to have a protective effect. And again, for a healthy individual with something like a common cold or something like that, something a little bit more benign than some of these other things that are out there, it's beneficial to just let things run its course. But with something a bit more nefarious, it could actually be quite beneficial, again, to actually be taking something that's dampening that inflammation, because it can be quite extreme and it can cause damage. So again, that's why this is all in the context of this is happening in a normal, healthy individual. Well, normal, we're all normal. Just an average, healthy human being.
Yes.
Someone who doesn't have high blood pressure or an inflammation disorder or whatever it may be, or different types of medication.
Yes.
So that's really important to mention. But in individuals like us, we're younger, we're healthier. If we get sick, let's just run maybe with the sickness a bit more than we're comfortable with, rather than prioritizing comfort and feeling okay. Maybe, but staying sick longer. I would rather prevent it from happening. So I do personally have to dial in our immune section of our stack, I think, a little bit more, because it could use a bit of tweaking. Like, we're not taking immune defense currently. We're not taking something like Epicor. So I do think there is an element of our stack that's currently missing. But I do think it is important to point out that for the last year, we've been doing our back to basics stack creation. So we dropped a lot of different supplements that we're normally taking, and we condensed it into something more basic. So we're covering a lot of our basics, and we're having really good effects with that. And we're still not getting sick as frequently. But I think it is time to build in a few more immune stimulators into the mix so that we have even better chances. So if you look at our stack, and if you look at kind of the stack we went through in the last podcast, there are definitely a lot of things in there that can have an immune boosting effect, but I think we could be a little bit better, including something like Epicor. We have the mushrooms in our stack now through Mushroom Magic Matcha, so I think that's really good.
Yeah.
But maybe even getting back on immune defense, because I really like immune defense, and I like immune defense just for its general inflammation regulating benefits and cognition enhancing effects. And there's a lot of people who talk about this on Reddit too. So if we were going to go to more of a general daily immune boosting stack that we would look at,
let's definitely start with Andrographis paniculata.
Andrographis, it is my favorite inflammation supplement. So this is another thing we've been doing in the last year. We've been going through a bunch of different ones. We tried out Long Vita, we tried out Cura White, We tried out Rethel, we tried out Holy Basil, and we tried out Boswellia, and then Andrographis. We kind of cycled in between them to see what is the best anti-inflammatory for us. For us, it's Andrographis. So we'll definitely be getting that back. And again, stopping it when we get sick. Because we were actually, now that I'm thinking about it, when I got sick, I was bumping up my Andrographis dose. Because I wanted to limit that viral replication, but I actually think I shot myself in the foot because I should have just stuck with it and had that full-blown inflammation response.
So is this stack going to be an immune boosting stack for normally, like all year round, or is this specifically when you're getting sick?
All year round. So Andrographis, vitamin D, vitamin C, the B vitamins. So in terms of products we carry, that would be Infinibee, Infinic, our vitamin D3 and MK7, our Andrographis paniculata extract, our micro zinc, and then let's see, that covers a lot of the basics already.
That covers magnesium. Our nutrients.
Magnesium is an important one too. So and we have that already too. And then some more of the niche things. I would like to do a trial with Emuse. So Emuse is a postbiotic supplement. So it basically is a probiotic that's then heat inactivated. So it's basically a dead probiotic, and the company that makes it is now calling this a postbiotic. They used to call it a probiotic, so it's kind of a probiotic, but not. But Emuse helps activate these PDSC cells, and those are kind of like the master regulator of the immune system. So their claim is that if you take this in, it has an effect on your gut microbiome system too, and it has an effect on these PDCS cells, and that has an immune stimulating effect. And from a lot of our customers on Reddit, I've heard that Emuse is really good for general overall gut health. So I think that would be an interesting one. So Emuse with Epicor to get more of that prebiotic. Glutathione, yes, that's an important one too, and we're already taking that. So, but that would definitely be one. And I would also like to try playing around with a bit more like L-arginine and L-citrulline. Those also have immune stimulating effects, especially because you need nitric oxide for that oxidative burst that kills these bacteria. Nitric oxide is an important inducer of inflammation too, interestingly enough. So topping some of those things up. But yeah, I would say Epicor, Emuse, maybe a combination of L-arginine and L-citrulline. And what else? I think that covers, like, hesperidin, I think, had a pretty interesting effect, and curicidin. That was actually also part of our initial prevention stack. Curicidin is also acting as a zinc ionophore. Actually, it's the curicidin that's acting as a zinc ionophore. The hesperidin was having more of an effect on viral replication. So, and that's a whole different world we could potentially get into at some point, but basically the replication mechanisms that you can then limit. But there's a lot of interesting things to explore there. And I think one interesting thing to really consider is that immune boosting supplements are going to have beneficial effects elsewhere. So almost look at the immune boosting effect as a nice side effect of the main effects that you're going for. Like Andrographis, we're going for it because it has a nice inflammation dampening effect, which is good for cognitive function, for my mood, for my joints, for how everything feels, but it also has beneficial immune regulating effects. And I think if we're only taking supplements not to get sick, maybe we're going a bit wrong. You should select supplements that have beneficial effects in your everyday life that make you feel good and have an immune boosting effect. Because
with that being said, I do think you could consider the opposite approach, which is to focus on these immune boosting supplements, knowing that when your immune system is functioning well, that other systems are also functioning well. Your gut, your cognition, your mood, your sleep, all these things. Because
and that's
it's
exactly
connected.
what I mean too. Yeah. So just the mindset being, if your mindset is, I'm only taking this because of its immune stimulating effects, but the mindset is more, I'm taking this for its immune stimulating effects, and my immune system has an effect on all of these other systems. So in that sense, it's nice to be taking something for my immune system. And then GABA could be an interesting one when you get sick. And I do think it is kind of interesting to come back and reflect on the experience with GABA.
Yeah.
We had a little break to recharge our camera battery, and Erika said, "Did you notice you were swearing a bit more than usual?" And I didn't, but I think I swear quite a bit in my normal everyday life, and
that I can confirm.
in my professional life, I try and limit that, especially because it's not great for the YouTube algorithm and stuff like that. But I think the relaxing, disinhibiting effects of the GABA we took definitely made me throw out some swear words there. So for anyone who's sensitive to that, I'm sorry.
But it is really interesting because your mood was like quite intense and kind of, just uninhibited. That's the best way that I can describe it. But yeah, for me, I felt quite relaxed from the GABA. I also felt the muscle relaxant, but I didn't experience that same kind of uninhibited sort of looseness. But it could also be just the topic. And for anybody who has been following along with Nootropics Depot for quite some time, this is the very first time that we're talking about sickness, that we're talking about immune system, that we're talking about ways to actually deal with getting sick. And so it's also like a touchy topic, and it's something that is really important, but all of these things are circling around in my mind, and that inhibition that lack of inhibition didn't really come through for me with the GABA. It was more just relaxing. But GABA is a really interesting option to be taking when you get sick, because it can have good benefits for your immune system, and then eventually for your recovery as well.
And also just like, maybe it doesn't have a strong anti-inflammatory effect, but it still has a nice muscle relaxant effect. So I think based on that, it can make you feel a bit better, and it can have beneficial effects on your overall immune response. So I think that's quite interesting, and I'll be following some more of the research that's coming out on it. But I do think it is interesting to note that, at least for me, the GABA certainly had quite a pronounced effect. Maybe for you a little bit less. But I think for something that for so many years has been, and partially us saying this too, that it doesn't have very pronounced effects, clearly it does.
It certainly does.
And it can have beneficial effects on your immune system. So I think that's really interesting.
For sure. Wow, we went through a serious amount of information on today's podcast. So when you want to go back and revisit certain sections, you can always do that because there's chapters. I'm going to link those podcasts that Emiel mentioned, as well as all the products that we talked about. And thanks again for listening to In Search of Insight. We're really glad to be able to share all this information with you and to discuss it with you on Reddit and on YouTube. So again, share the podcast with your friends. Let us know what you learned. Feel free to ask us questions in the comments. And we hope that your immune system is nice and strong, keeping you healthy and doing what it needs to do. And if you've found really nice supplements or interesting approaches to boosting your immune system, we also want to hear about it. So don't be shy, and definitely reach out to us on Reddit r/Nootropics Depot. So next month, we're coming to you with a totally different topic, lots of research and more supplements. And we will say goodbye for today. See ya.